the hush of a sleeping world, beneath the glow of moonlight and the rustle of distant trees, there lies a story that once cracked the silence of an empire, a tale not just of muskets and marching boots, but of whispered hopes, trembling hands, and a dream stitched into stars. It began in shadows, with quiet defiance, and rose like a dawn no tyrant could stop. Tonight, we return to the fields and firelit halls where liberty was born. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. This is the complete history of the American Revolution. Chapter 1: The Empire After Victory. The war was over. The rifles had grown quiet. The trees that once echoed with musket fire now stood in stillness, branches swaying gently in a breeze that no longer carried the scent of gunpowder. It was 1763, and the British Empire had emerged victorious from the long and brutal French and Indian War. To the east of the Atlantic, in the grand halls of London, there was pride, yes, but also silence, heavy with the weight of consequence. The victory had come at a cost far greater than anyone had dared to admit in the flush of conquest. The war, fought across continents, had left Britain with an empire larger than ever before, but also burdened with a staggering debt. The coffers were drained, and the crown now looked west, not with celebration, but with calculation. Canada had fallen into British hands, as had Florida, and the threat of French power in North America had faded like mist at sunrise. But peace did not mean ease. A new question emerged from the ashes of war: how to govern and pay for this vast and newly expanded dominion. British officials, tired from years of conflict, now sat before maps covered in ink and speculation. They saw 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic, and a continent beyond them teeming with uncharted land, native nations, and risk. It was no longer enough to simply claim land. It had to be administered, protected, taxed. Red-coated soldiers had to be stationed, roads built, treaties made and broken, and above all, the empire had to make sense of its own magnitude. The war had made Britain great, but greatness came with a price tag. A price the government hoped, quietly, the colonies might help pay. In the dim corridors of Whitehall, men spoke in hushed voices about taxes, trade, and order. There was a sense of urgency, a belief that the colonies must now mature, must now contribute. No longer children of the empire, they would be expected to shoulder part of its burdens. But across the ocean, that expectation would feel less like shared responsibility and more like a tightening grip. Dreams across the sea. While ministers in London drew boundaries and balanced budgets, life in the colonies carried a different rhythm, one of possibility, ambition, and hope. In towns and farmlands from Massachusetts to Georgia, the end of the war felt like the dawn of a new era. Veterans returned from distant battles with stories in their mouths and dreams in their hearts. Merchants, who had weathered the uncertainties of wartime trade, looked forward to prosperity. Farmers, speculators, and young families turned their gaze westward, toward lands they had bled to protect. The American frontier was more than geography, it was promise. To many colonists, the lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains were part of their reward for loyalty and sacrifice. For years, they had fought in the king's name, died under the king's banner, and now, they longed for the fruits of victory. They imagined fertile valleys, untapped rivers, and new towns where their children could build futures. The frontier was their inheritance, and in their minds, it had already begun to belong to them. The dream, however, was not shared by those across the sea. The British Crown, fearful of further conflict with Native American nations and wary of the costs of defending scattered settlements, viewed the frontier not as opportunity but as liability. And so, in October of 1763, the king issued a royal decree, the Proclamation of 1763. In a single stroke of ink, it declared that no colonist could settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. The frontier was closed, the gates locked. To London, it was a matter of stability and control. To the colonists, it was betrayal, the line no one wanted. The proclamation line of 1763 was drawn like a wound across the map. It was a line invisible on the land but seared into the minds of those it constrained. From the green hills of Pennsylvania to the smoky ridges of North Carolina, settlers read the royal edict with disbelief. This land, they believed, had been won with their blood. Who was the king to say it now lay beyond reach? At first, the line seemed like an inconvenience. But as months passed and enforcement began, British soldiers turning back pioneers, denying land grants, enforcing the invisible boundary, it became more than that. It became a symbol of how far the crown truly was. London, with its polished floors and powdered wigs, did not understand the earth under colonial boots, the hunger for land, or the dreams it fed. To many colonists, the line felt like a paper wall built not to protect them, but to contain them. In taverns and newspapers, voices began to stir. The line was meant to keep peace with native nations, but it sowed discord among settlers instead. Some ignored it, slipping through mountain passes under cover of fog. Others protested more openly, writing letters, organizing petitions, and demanding that their sacrifices not be erased by royal ink. Land speculators, many of them wealthy and politically connected, were particularly outraged. They had already invested in Western lands, sold promises to buyers, and now saw their fortunes threatened. The line wasn't just about freedom, it was about property, economy, and power. And beneath the surface of these arguments, a deeper wound began to form. The growing sense that the colonies were not partners in empire, but pawns in a distant game. Whispers of discontent. At first, the voices were soft. In the flickering light of evening taverns, they were no louder than murmurs over tankards of ale. But from Boston's narrow cobbled streets to the wide tobacco fields of Virginia, those whispers grew bolder, steadier. They were not yet cries of rebellion, just questions. But questions, as history often shows, are where revolutions begin. Why, some asked, should decisions about American lands be made in London parlors by men who had never seen the forests or felt the soil? Why were colonial assemblies not consulted? Why did the empire take, restrict, and forbid, yet never seem to listen? Among the discontented were many kinds of people. Soldiers who felt forgotten, merchants who felt choked by regulations, farmers denied land, and lawyers who saw in the proclamation a violation of rights. Even some loyal subjects began to wonder whether the empire they had served so faithfully truly saw them as equals. The line had drawn more than a geographic boundary. It had exposed a growing divide between the vision of empire and the lived reality of its colonies. Newspapers became quiet battlegrounds. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand, raising arguments not just about land, but about liberty. Words like representation, justice, and natural rights began to appear more frequently. They did not yet call for independence, but they hinted at something new, a rethinking of what it meant to be part of the British Empire. The proclamation of 1763 would not remain the lone grievance. It was the first stone in a wall that would rise brick by brick over the coming years. A wall built not of wood or stone, but of laws, taxes, and resentments. And while few could have foreseen what lay ahead, the air in the colonies had changed. The war had ended, but the peace was uneasy, and in the stillness of that uneasy calm, the American identity, raw, uncertain, and bold, began to stir. In the shadows of hearths and beneath the stars of the frontier, people spoke in low tones about fairness, about being heard, about the promise of something greater than obedience. Not revolution, not yet, but the roots of discontent had found soil, and in time they would grow. Though the empire after victory stood tall in the eyes of the world, cracks had begun to show, hairline fractures in the marble facade. It would be years before those cracks became fissures, before whispers became declarations. But already, the stillness of peace was giving way to the rustle of unrest. As lanterns dimmed in the homes of farmers, lawyers, veterans, and merchants, a new kind of question hovered in the dark. What does it mean to be free when your future is mapped by others? And in that question, soft as a sigh, steady as a tide, America's long and restless journey had quietly begun. Chapter 2, Taxation and the Fire Kindled. In the stillness after the 7 Years' War, a new kind of tension settled over the American colonies. It was not the roar of cannon or clash of bayonets, but something quieter, sharper, and more enduring. In 1764, the Sugar Act swept through the colonies like a wind that seemed mild on the surface but carried the scent of distant storms. On parchment, it was a measure of revenue, signed with flourish in London's marble halls. But in the narrow, weather-worn streets of Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia, it was felt like a shadow falling across the future. At its heart, the Sugar Act aimed to refill the British treasury, drained by war and swollen with debts. Molasses, sugar, and other imported goods were now taxed, and what once flowed freely through merchant ships now trickled, wrapped in ledgers and regulations. Yet it wasn't just the tax itself that stirred resentment. It was the manner in which it reached into the lives of colonists. Smugglers, who had long danced in the gray zones of law and trade, now found their livelihoods declared criminal. Naval officers were given powers to seize ships, and the once flexible customs practices hardened into chains. In taverns and counting houses, merchants muttered of lost profits and unjust seizures. Colonial lawyers, poring over ancient rights, whispered of Magna Carta and liberty. The press began to tremble with boldness, and while many still considered themselves loyal subjects of the crown, something subtle began to shift. This was not a riot, nor yet a rebellion, but it was disquiet, spreading like smoke from a distant fire. The Sugar Act had done something dangerous. It had made the colonists feel governed not as partners, but as possessions. And once that feeling awakened, it would not easily sleep again. The stamp that sealed rebellion. Then came 1765, and with it, the Stamp Act. If the Sugar Act had touched the harbor and the merchant scale, the Stamp Act touched everyone. It was ink and wax on every corner of colonial life. Paper for deeds, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and even marriage licenses. Suddenly, the royal seal was not just in courtrooms or government buildings. It was in the cradle and the hearth, pressed into the hands of ordinary people. This was the first time Parliament imposed a direct internal tax on the colonies without their consent. There had been duties before, taxes on trade, on goods passing through, but never had there been a charge laid upon the colonists' daily doings, their speech, their agreements, their written lives. And in this intrusion, there was something that cut deeper than money. It was the principle, quietly thunderous. Who had the right to reach across the sea and bind them so? The reaction was swift, but not chaotic. It was thoughtful, organized, and fierce. In Virginia, a young Patrick Henry rose before the House of Burgesses and declared, "If this be treason, make the most of it." His voice echoed into taverns and courthouses across the colonies. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams called together minds and inked resistance into resolutions. Across the colonies, the Stamp Act Congress convened, uniting representatives in protest, an early symphony of shared defiance. Then, on the streets, the Sons of Liberty stirred. Effigies of tax collectors were hung from trees, bonfires roared with symbolic fury, and the stamped papers were burned or refused. Printers published without permission. Noisy crowds chanted not for violence, but for rights. It was not yet a revolution, but it was something unmissable. A people discovering the power of saying no. And the most unnerving part for London was this. Despite the uproar, the colonies still wore the trappings of loyalty. They toasted the king, they spoke of English rights. But within their hearts, the Stamp Act had kindled something deeper. The first realization that their liberty was not being preserved, but taxed. And that realization would not fade. Quartering and quiet fury. As if to underscore the distance between ruler and ruled, another act followed close behind, one quieter in its language, yet deeply unsettling in its reach. The Quartering Act of 1765 did not demand gold or tariffs. It demanded shelter. It required that colonists provide housing, food, and supplies for British soldiers stationed among them. On paper, it was a measure of military logistics, but in the warmth of a colonial home, it felt like an unwanted knock on the door. To many, the presence of redcoats was already unnerving. Soldiers had once marched to protect, to guard against foreign threats. But now they stood on street corners not as saviors, but as watchers. In cities like New York, where barracks were scarce, the act meant that homes, taverns, and inns might be requisitioned for the crown's needs. And while some colonists complied, many bristled at the quiet insult of it. This assumption that their walls and hearths were subject to imperial command. There was no explosion, No great uprising in response to this act. But there was something more enduring: resentment. It curled itself into letters and sermons, into private conversations and public editorials. Mothers felt it in the eyes of their children, who watched uniformed men eat at their tables. Fathers felt it in the hollow silence where once they had spoken freely. Freedom, they thought, was not only about taxes and laws, it was about space, about the right to be left alone. And when soldiers filled their streets and their homes, that right began to feel like a memory. In the years to come, the Quartering Act would be remembered not as a spark, but as the slow, steady rubbing of stone against stone. It was part of the friction that would eventually light the flame. For even when a man bore hardship in silence, his soul remembered each intrusion, and the soul of a nation was beginning to stir. A legal earthquake. As the weight of acts and orders mounted, a phrase began to take root. Simple, rhythmic, undeniable. No taxation without representation. It was more than a slogan. It was a boundary drawn not in blood, but in thought. It meant that a free people could not be governed without their voice, that laws imposed without their consent were not just unfair, they were void. This idea, born in English soil and shaped by centuries of political struggle, now returned to the empire's edges as a challenge. The colonists saw themselves not as rebels, but as heirs to English liberty. They read Locke and Montesquieu, quoted Blackstone, and believed that the rights of Englishmen did not fade with distance. And so they asked, not yet shouted, but asked to be heard. Petitions were sent. Debates flourished in assemblies. Pamphlets passed hand to hand, their language sharp with clarity. John Dickinson wrote that if Parliament could tax them without consent, there was no limit to what it might do. James Otis spoke of natural rights, and the press inked his words with reverence. Even those who still hoped for reconciliation felt the ground shifting. This was not yet revolution, it was resistance through law, through logic, through the assertion of rights. But to the British government, the colonies were subjects, not equals. Parliament responded not with understanding, but with more pressure. The Declaratory Act followed the repeal of the Stamp Act, affirming Britain's absolute right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And in those words, so firm, so final, the distance between London and the colonies became a chasm. For many colonists, that moment was a quiet earthquake. Their loyalty, once deep-rooted and heartfelt, trembled, and in its place rose something new, a vision of liberty not granted by rulers, but born in men. Not a gift to be begged for, but a right to be claimed. As this chapter closes, we see not muskets or barricades, but minds awakening. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, and the quiet arrogance of the Declaratory Act, they had all struck different notes. But together, they formed the early chords of a symphony that would soon rise in volume. The fire had not yet leapt into open flame, but it had been kindled in courtrooms, in parlors, in printing presses and prayers. A fire of thought, of principle, of freedom waiting for its hour. And as the night deepened across the Atlantic world, the spark of rebellion began to glow softly, steadily, in the hearts of a people who would not forget. Chapter 3: Sons, Daughters, and Defiance. The streets of Boston were lined with smoke and silence, but beneath that silence stirred something restless and new. From taverns tucked behind wooden doors and homes with candlelit windows, whispers moved like wind across the cobblestones. They were not just whispers of grievance, they were words of resolve. In 1765, as news of the hated Stamp Act took root in every colony, a group of men gathered not to pray or plead, but to act. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. They were not generals or kings, not men with armies behind them, but tailors, merchants, printers, and blacksmiths. Yet, in their ordinary lives burned an extraordinary fire. Samuel Adams, a failed brewer turned political thinker, found in these times a calling greater than commerce. With ink-stained fingers and a voice that stirred the heart, he helped organize protests that would reshape the very soul of America. Their meetings were secret, but their message was loud. Effigies of tax collectors, crafted with straw and stitched in mockery, hung from trees in city squares. Crowds gathered, not in fear, but in growing courage. In New York, they marched down the streets with drums and banners. In Boston, they surrounded customs houses with chants of no taxation without representation, and in the stillness of southern towns, fires glowed in the distance where symbols of oppression were reduced to ash. Word traveled fast. A bonfire in Massachusetts lit sparks in Rhode Island. A protest in Connecticut gave breath to resistance in the Carolinas. The colonies, each one once a separate world of its own, began to listen to one another, drawn together by the rhythm of a new rebellion. Courage became a currency, and it was spent freely. Even women, though not named among the sons, stitched their defiance into quilts, wrote letters of encouragement, and taught their children what liberty might mean. The resistance had no throne and no crown, but it had a beating heart, and it pulsed in the hands of everyday people. This was not yet a war, not yet, but it was something powerful, a gathering storm, a nation's first breath, a nation in the making. Though the colonies were separated by forests, rivers, and differing customs, something deeper than geography was beginning to change. The committees of correspondence, quietly and patiently, stitched the fabric of unity. Born first in Massachusetts, these committees sent letters like lanterns through the darkness, carrying news from village to village, colony to colony. Before the committees, a protest in Boston might mean little to a farmer in Georgia. A march in New York might pass unnoticed by a printer in Virginia. But with pen and ink, these scattered stories became one. Riders galloped through night winds, carrying folded parchment sealed with wax. Letters that bore witness to arrests, protests, and British reactions. What one colony suffered, the others now understood. In candlelit halls, colonists read aloud the latest from distant neighbors, their eyes widening not just with anger, but with connection. It was not only Boston's burden, it was everyone's. Words like liberty, rights, and representation were no longer local ideals, they were shared dreams. And so, a schoolteacher in Delaware might weep at news from South Carolina. A merchant in Maryland might offer money to support a legal fight in Massachusetts. The distance between colonies no longer felt so vast. The Atlantic Ocean was still wide, but between Boston and Charleston, a sense of kinship had begun to bloom. This growing web of correspondence became more than news. It was the voice of a people realizing they were not alone. And in that shared realization, the idea of a single nation, though still fragile and faint, began to flicker in the imagination. It was not yet a republic. It was not yet revolution, but it was something stirring, something beginning. A new awareness was forming, like the early glimmers of dawn before the full light. Voices in the halls, while fires burned in the streets and messages rode through the night. Another battle stirred in quieter places, in the colonial assemblies, town halls, and public forums where voices, not muskets, became weapons of change. Here, the language of protest matured. Farmers, no longer content with silent endurance, began speaking in terms of natural rights. Lawyers rose in standing not for their wealth, but for their courage to challenge the authority of Parliament with words sharp as steel. Writers dipped their pens not just in ink, but in vision. One such writer was John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. His letters from a farmer were read across the colonies like scripture. He did not call for violence, but his arguments lit minds afire. He spoke of liberty as sacred, of British overreach as betrayal. People who had never read political theory now passed his letters hand to hand, copying them in notebooks and reciting them in taverns. In Virginia, Patrick Henry stood tall in the House of Burgesses. His voice carried thunder when he warned that if this be treason, they might as well make the most of it. There was a rhythm to his speech, something that shook the very rafters of the halls. Words, he knew, could rally a nation before armies ever marched. And beyond these famous names were countless others. Unknown teachers, preachers, and shopkeepers, who began to speak as citizens of something greater. They asked questions that were once unthinkable. What is a colony without a voice? What is loyalty if it demands silence? What is freedom if it is granted only by favor? The colonies were still bound to Britain by law, by tradition, and by fear. But something inside those halls had changed. They had learned to speak. And once people learn to speak, they do not easily return to silence. The voices did not all agree. There were still loyalists, still moderates, still many unsure. But the debate itself had become sacred. To speak, to question, to dream aloud, this too was defiance. And this too was revolution. The Stamp Act falls. In March of 1766, word arrived across the ocean like a long-awaited breath. The British Parliament had repealed the Stamp Act. It was over. The tax that had stirred cities into outrage, that had given birth to the Sons of Liberty and United Colonies in grievance, was gone. The bells rang out in every town. Streets filled with cheers. Church bells and cannons echoed with celebration. People toasted freedom, sang songs, and waved banners high. Even loyalists joined the joy. For a brief moment, it felt as though the storm had passed and peace had returned. But victory, as it often does in the history of revolutions, came with a shadow. For on the very same day they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. In it, they declared that the Crown held full authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. To some, this line seemed a formality. To others, it was a thunderclap. The threat had not disappeared. It had merely changed its mask. The king and his ministers had not learned to listen. They had only chosen to wait. Power, once challenged, rarely forgets the challenge. And yet, the repeal gave the colonies something precious. It gave them proof that resistance could work, that protest could shake Parliament, that defiance, organized and steady, had power. The victory belonged not to soldiers, but to merchants who boycotted British goods, to writers who swayed minds, to women who spun homespun cloth instead of buying imports, and to farmers who stood tall in their local assemblies. The joy of repeal was not just about the tax, it was about self-worth, about being heard, about finding a voice in the echoing chambers of empire. And even as Parliament reasserted its power, the colonies stood taller than before. For they had won something intangible yet unshakable: belief. Belief that the colonies could stand against the crown, not as scattered voices but as one. The fire was not extinguished. It had been fanned. The silence of submission had been broken. And from that moment onward, the American people would never again be content to live quietly beneath the weight of another's will. The chapter of the Stamp Act was closed. But the book of rebellion had only just begun to be written. Chapter 4: Tea, Tariffs, and a Slow Storm. Glass, paper, paint. Things once taken for granted, simple, small, woven into the fabric of daily life, suddenly carried the heavy scent of foreign control. In 1767, the Townshend Acts arrived like a quiet tightening of the noose. They were not as loud as the Stamp Act, not as brazen as quartering soldiers in homes, but their silence was sharp. These were taxes placed not on grand trade or imported luxuries, but on the very thread of living: window panes, newspapers, ledgers, tea, and brushes. These weren't just goods. They were touch points everywhere, in every household, on every table and shelf. The British Parliament believed they had found a gentler way to raise revenue. Rather than direct taxes, duties would be collected at the ports. The goods would arrive, taxed, and slip into the colonial marketplace like shadows. But the colonies had changed. The whisper of tyranny was heard even in the jingle of coins exchanged for a bottle of ink or a pane of glass. Benjamin Franklin, watching from London, warned Parliament that the colonists would see these taxes as more than just economic. To them, they struck at freedom. Representation the colonies had cried before. Consent. Liberty. In the streets of Boston, of Philadelphia, of New York, men gathered beneath liberty trees and in the corners of taverns. There, they read essays passed hand to hand, inked in midnight, soaked with urgency. One voice rose again and again, that of John Dickinson, whose Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania sang like a bell across the colonies. "We are taxed without our consent," he wrote. "And if we are silent now, what will come next?" The reaction was not explosive but steady. Boycotts were organized. British imports sat untouched in storehouses. Merchants faced pressure, sometimes gentle, sometimes not. The resistance was spreading, not as a riot, but as a mood, soft but solid, like a tide slowly rising. The chains were not visible, but their weight was felt in every taxed cup of tea, in every smuggled brushstroke. Something quiet was changing, like clouds building on the horizon. A storm was forming, and few yet saw how fierce it would become. Women in the fight. While men gave speeches in town halls and wrote tracts in candlelight, another rebellion bloomed in quieter places, over stoves, in parlors, and beside spinning wheels. The Daughters of Liberty, as they came to be called, were not just symbolic participants in the unrest. They were its heartbeat. British cloth, once a mark of refinement, became a scarlet stain on conscience. Homespun became the fashion, not out of frugality, but as defiance. In Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Virginia, women gathered in groups not only to discuss news but to act. They spun yarn and wove cloth with calloused fingers and patient rhythm. The whirring wheels and clicking looms sang a song of rebellion no redcoat could hear. Tea parties turned political, not the kind with porcelain and politeness, but ones where tea was poured out, refused, or replaced with herbal blends steeped in resistance. In these moments, the home became a battlefield, the hearth a post of protest. These women taught their children stories of liberty between chores and recited the names of men like Otis, Adams, and Franklin as if they were scripture. But they also wrote their own chapters. When British luxuries were removed from the market, colonial women didn't complain. They adapted. They stitched new dresses, brewed new beverages, and turned scarcity into strength. To deny them goods was to grant them purpose. Their power was not loud, but it was unshakable. A simple apron, sewn by a daughter for her mother, became a flag. A pot of tea refused became a vote. Liberty was no longer just discussed in halls of power or in printed pamphlets. It was baked into bread, poured into cups, and folded into linens. These women, unnamed in many history books, were weaving the very fabric of a new world. The Liberty seized, and then it happened. On a clear June morning in 1768, a ship named Liberty, owned by the fiery merchant John Hancock, was seized by British customs officers in Boston Harbor. The charge, smuggling. But in truth, the seizure was less about law and more about message. The British sought to remind the colonies who ruled the seas, who controlled the ports, who had the final word. But they misjudged the moment. Hancock was not merely a businessman, he was a symbol. To seize his ship was to strike at the pride of Boston itself. Crowds gathered, voices rose, tensions boiled. In the streets, people surged with indignation, not just over the ship, but over the sense that their home was no longer theirs. British troops were sent to restore order, their red coats bright against the gray stone and cobbled paths of the city. They arrived with drums and discipline, but their presence spoke of distrust. The soldiers were not foreign invaders. They were now neighbors. Stationed in homes, quartered among civilians, they walked the same streets, drank from the same wells, and yet they were not of the people. They were reminders, constant, sharp, unblinking. What had been tension became atmosphere. Shops closed early. Murmurs filled the taverns. Eyes watched every movement, both British and colonial. Children played less freely in the squares. Even laughter seemed thinner in the air. Boston had changed. A city that once bustled with noisy port life now carried an uneasy quiet. The liberty was gone, but something else had been taken with it. The illusion that resistance could remain polite. Now, the British flag above the harbor seemed less a banner of empire and more a storm warning. The redcoats stood not just in formation, but in the minds of every colonist. Something deeper than a ship was lost. Trust had cracked, and suspicion had taken its place. Prelude to tragedy. And so the storm built. One flake at a time, tensions layered. Winter came to Boston not only in snow but in silence and suspicion. It was the beginning of 1770, and beneath the frost, something was simmering. British soldiers walked their posts, but their presence was no longer neutral. Colonists stared at them as invaders. Children taunted them. Workers scowled. It was as if the city itself held its breath, waiting. On the night of March 5th, the powder keg finally found its spark. A lone British sentry, Private Hugh White, stood guard outside the custom house. Snow fell. The air was bitter, A crowd began to gather, boys with frostbitten cheeks, dockworkers with calloused fists, shopkeepers angry with empty ledgers. Insults flew. Snowballs followed. Some say there were rocks hidden within them. Others say it was all just noise and ice. But in the confusion, in the dim light of the lanterns, bells rang out and more soldiers came. They lined up, muskets raised but not yet fired. The crowd grew louder, tighter, angrier. Someone shouted. Someone slipped. The club was raised. A soldier was struck. And then a shot. It rang through the cold like thunder. Then another, and another. It lasted seconds. When it ended, 5 colonists lay bleeding on the snow-covered street. One of them was Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and native descent, perhaps the first to fall in this long road toward liberty. Silence followed the shots. The crowd dispersed like fog. The soldiers stood stunned. The snow, once pure, was stained. The Boston Massacre, as it would come to be called, was not a battle. It was not a war. It was a tragedy. And yet it marked a turning. The innocence, if ever there was any, was gone. The city mourned. Paul Revere etched the moment into metal, turning blood into image, sorrow into symbol. Samuel Adams ensured the dead would not be forgotten. Trials followed. Debate spread. In England, some dismissed it. In America, few could forget. This was no longer about taxes, no longer about tea or cloth. It was about lives, about who ruled and who obeyed, about what justice meant when a king stood far away and a soldier stood on your street. The snow melted. Spring would come. But in that winter, Boston had already changed. The quiet storm had begun to roar. Not yet into war, but into resolve. The colonies, once tied by trade and shared grievance, now shared something deeper. Grief, purpose, and memory. And from that memory, a revolution was beginning to breathe. Chapter 5. A Harbor of Tea and Thunder. It began, as many things do in empires, with something deceptively simple. A leaf, dried, crumbled, steeped in hot water tea. But beneath its steam and sweetness, this leaf carried the weight of imperial ambition, corporate monopoly, and colonial resentment. In the year 1773, far across the sea from Boston's winding cobblestone streets, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, a law meant to save a failing giant, the East India Company. Laden with debts and overstocked warehouses, the company was granted a privilege no other had, the right to ship tea directly to the American colonies without the usual duties. It would be cheaper than ever before. Too cheap, in fact. To London, it seemed a brilliant solution. To Boston, it felt like a trap. The Tea Act did not raise a new tax. That battle had already been fought on parchment and protest signs. Instead, it bypassed colonial merchants and confirmed something more poisonous than taxation. That Parliament could legislate not just policy, but principle. That even economic gifts could carry chains. Tea was everywhere in the colonies. In the drawing rooms of Charleston, the parlors of Philadelphia, and the kitchens of Boston's brick homes, tea warmed hearts and filled moments. But now it symbolized surrender. To accept this tea, however cheap, was to sip the notion that liberty could be bargained, that rights could be sold in crates. As word of the Tea Act spread, something stirred deep beneath the calm surface of colonial life. A quiet rumble, like the first distant clap of a coming storm. In towns and taverns, by firelight and on courthouse steps, whispers grew into voices, and voices, in time, into fury. Adams and the art of protest. Samuel Adams was not a soldier, nor a wealthy man. But he was something far more dangerous in a time of rising unrest. He was a storyteller. And with ink, voice, and vision, he could turn frustration into purpose, and purpose into movement. In Boston, the old city where his words carried like wind through alleyways, Adams became the architect of indignation. He saw the Tea Act for what it truly was, not just a merchant's maneuver, but a message. Britain was reminding the colonies who ruled the tides. But Adams, with his deep understanding of the human spirit, knew that resistance would not rise from policy debates alone. It had to be felt in the bone. It had to be dramatic. And so he set the stage. In town meetings, he asked simple questions with impossible answers. If we are taxed without representation, are we still free? He asked. If we accept even one unjust law, how soon do the others follow? In the crowded halls of Boston's Old South Meeting House, he guided conversations like a conductor, each complaint a note, each fear a chord in a building symphony of defiance. When ships arrived in Boston Harbor bearing the East India Company's tea, Adams did not strike first, but he made sure the stage was set when the curtain rose. The streets were tense, thick with people and purpose. Flyers plastered the walls, calling for unity. Dockworkers, farmers, printers, and smiths, people from every walk of colonial life, came to listen, to speak, and to wait. And Adams waited too, not for permission, but for clarity. His strength was not only in what he said, but in how he let the people own the moment. And when the time came, it would not be Adams alone who acted. It would be Boston itself, breathing in unison with the heartbeat of revolution. The night of the Tea Party, December 16, 1773. The air was cold and the harbor quiet, save for the groan of ships in their moorings and the distant murmur of crowds gathering near Griffin's Wharf. 3 ships sat anchored in the moonlit bay, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Their holds were heavy with tea. Their decks would soon be empty. Under cover of darkness, men emerged, their faces painted and their bodies cloaked in blankets. Not true Mohawks, but patriots borrowing the mask of the wild. They moved not with chaos, but with choreographed resolve. No torches were lit, no weapons raised, only the sounds of boots on wood, of hatches opened, of crates lifted and thrown. 342 chests, nearly 90,000 pounds of tea. One by one, they crashed into the water. A ritual not of violence, but of volume, of waves splashing over protest. The harbor grew bitter with leaves, a brew of rebellion seeping into the Atlantic. On shore, crowds stood in reverent silence. No cheers, no riots, no blood. It was a protest as disciplined as it was defiant. The message was clear not just to the crown but to the colonies. Resistance could be bold without being reckless. They took nothing, broke nothing but the crates, left no stain but principle. By morning, the waters around Boston were darker, not from bloodshed, but from tea leaves. And from those leaves a fire would rise. The crown strikes back. London did not take long to respond. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached Parliament, the reaction was swift and severe, not merely a tightening of laws, but a declaration of control. In the spring of 1774, the coercive acts were passed, known in the colonies by a name far more bitter, the Intolerable Acts. Boston, the beating heart of the resistance, was to be punished. The harbor was closed, strangling trade. The Massachusetts Charter was revoked, dissolving its self-governance. Trials of British officials accused of crimes could now be held in England, far from colonial juries. And soldiers, redcoats, would now be quartered in the homes of the people they ruled. But if the goal was to isolate Boston, it failed. Across the 13 colonies, the news of Britain's retaliation sent ripples of unity. In towns far from the harbor, people who had never seen its ships or smelled its salt air began to call Boston their own. South Carolina sent rice to feed the hungry. Virginia's House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting in protest. In Pennsylvania, in New York, in Maryland, voices rose not in sympathy, but in solidarity. The coercive acts were meant to break a city. Instead, they built a continent. And beneath the weight of these laws, something new began to take shape. Not just resistance, but resolve. Not just outrage, but organization. In time, delegates would gather in Philadelphia, not yet to declare independence, but to stand together, a flicker of federation, born from a cup of tea and the bitterness that followed. Thus ends a chapter not of war, but of will. A harbor once known for trade became the altar of defiance. Attacks once seen as trivial became the tipping point of an empire's unraveling. In the rustle of tea leaves on water, in the silence of midnight protesters, in the quiet fury of a city punished, the American Revolution took a breath and stepped forward. And the world, watching, would never forget the sound of tea hitting the sea, the gentle splash that echoed like thunder. Chapter 6. From Protest to Congress. The winds that swept through Boston's harbor in the summer of 1774 did not carry the usual scent of salt and trade. No ships creaked gently at their moorings. No goods were hauled onto the wharves by sweating sailors. Instead, the water lay strangely still, empty, guarded, and silent. The port of Boston had been closed. By the order of a distant parliament and a king across the sea, the city's heartbeat was silenced in reprisal for rebellion. But though Boston's harbor was sealed, the eyes of a continent began to open. The Boston Port Act, one of several punitive laws passed by the British in response to the Tea Party, aimed to starve the city into submission. The lifeblood of commerce, of sustenance and survival, was choked. But what the British intended as punishment became something far greater. Across the 13 colonies, word traveled swiftly, by courier, by whisper, by newspaper ink still wet with truth. Boston was under siege not by cannon but by policy. And this act of force became a spark. In towns far from Massachusetts Bay, men and women who had never set foot on Boston's crooked streets now felt as though they walked beside its suffering. Wagons laden with flour, livestock, and money began to roll northward, not for profit, but for solidarity. Even in the heat of a southern summer, Virginia planters and merchants sent their goods north, declaring Boston's cause their own. The port was closed, but something deeper had opened, an invisible road of unity. Among cobblestone alleys and candlelit parlors, conversations shifted. If Boston could be punished so easily, what security did any colony have? What shield could protect them if Parliament chose to strike again? The shutdown of a single harbor revealed a larger truth. The distance between London and the colonies was not only measured in miles but in understanding. And in that space, new thoughts began to stir. What had begun as resistance was now taking the shape of something greater. The colonies were watching, thinking, and waking up. The intolerable truth. What followed Boston's punishment was not leniency, but a tightening of the grip. A set of laws that colonists would call the intolerable acts descended like a curtain, opaque, unyielding, and deliberate. Parliament, convinced that order must be restored through discipline, pressed forward with new decrees. But what they considered firm governance, the colonists saw as the beginning of tyranny. The Massachusetts Government Act struck at the heart of self-rule. Town meetings, once the lifeblood of New England civic life, were severely restricted. Judges were no longer chosen locally but appointed by the Crown. Power shifted from the hands of neighbors to those of royal governors and military men. To those who had long cherished the village green as a forum of liberty, this was no small loss. It was an erasure. Equally alarming was the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in England. To many Americans, it seemed a license to act with impunity, a declaration that British lives were valued more than their own. The balance of justice, once fragile but familiar, now tilted beyond reach. And then came the Quebec Act. Though less directly aimed at the rebellious colonies, it cast a long shadow. It expanded the borders of Quebec into lands claimed by other colonies and protected the rights of Catholics in that region. An act viewed with suspicion by many Protestant colonists. Though religious tolerance in itself was no sin, in the climate of fear and reaction, this gesture appeared calculated. It hinted at a future shaped not by shared voice, but by imperial design. For the first time, Americans across the colonies began to imagine what their world might look like if these laws stood unchallenged. The picture was unsettling. A world where rights were revoked at will, where justice bent to royal favor, where religious and civic freedoms might vanish not with a roar, but with a pen. The truth they saw was intolerable, and it began to bind them together. The First Continental Congress. In September 1774, beneath the rising heat of the Pennsylvania sun, they came farmers and lawyers, merchants and planters, men of quiet conviction and fiery speech. 56 delegates, drawn from 12 colonies, gathered in Philadelphia to seek something not yet named but deeply felt, a unified response. It was the First Continental Congress. They met in Carpenter's Hall, a building meant for craft and trade, now echoing with words that would shape nations. Each man brought the concerns of his colony, but more than that, he brought the weight of a growing cause. There were differences, to be sure. Some, like Patrick Henry, burned for bold action. Others urged caution, holding fast to hope for reconciliation. But even amid disagreement, something ancient stirred, the possibility of consensus. The delegates debated long and deep, not only with intellect, but with hearts burdened by uncertainty. Would speaking too forcefully draw blood? Would silence be mistaken for submission? The hall rang with reasoned pleas and solemn warnings. Outside, the streets bustled, but within, the air was thick with history in the making. By the flicker of candlelight, they drafted resolves. They affirmed colonial rights. They declared the intolerable acts null and void. And they pledged to meet again if grievances remained unanswered. They were not yet calling for independence. That word still hovered like a ghost at the edges of thought. But the Congress had done something extraordinary. It had created the rhythm of unity, the early heartbeat of a new kind of nation. These men were not kings. They had no army. They commanded no treasury. But in gathering, they had forged the first bond of what would one day be America. Not from decree, but from discourse. Not from power, but from principle. And as they adjourned that October, a silent agreement carried them home. The road ahead would not be walked alone. The association forms. In the quiet that followed the Congress, action took root. Not in parliaments, but in kitchens, in fields, in village greens. For amid the grand speeches and official declarations, a plan had been sown, the Continental Association. Not a government, not yet, but something bold. An agreement among the colonies to stop importing goods from Britain, and to prepare for deeper resistance if needed. It was not signed by generals, but by neighbors. It relied not on weapons, but on will. In towns and counties from New Hampshire to Georgia, local committees sprang up, ordinary citizens determined to make the words of Congress live in the soil of daily life. Merchants rewrote their ledgers. Households changed what they purchased. Blacksmiths and bakers joined hands in common purpose. This was protest made practical. The power of the association lay in its simplicity. It gave structure to defiance, a framework for resistance. No longer were colonists acting in scattered anger. They were becoming coordinated. They were organizing. And through these committees, the idea of self-rule began to grow not just in theory, but in experience. Boycotts became more than economic pressure. They became declarations of identity. Refusing British goods became a way of saying, we see ourselves as something else now. Even as trade slowed and goods grew scarce, the sense of purpose swelled. In homes lit by oil lamps and at tables bare of tea, Americans were shaping something lasting, a collective will. And though British officials dismissed these movements as mere noise, they missed what was forming beneath, a quiet revolution of mind and spirit. By the time 1774 gave way to 1775, the colonies were no longer merely subjects of a crown. They were communities bound by shared decisions, shared risk, and a shared story in the making. They had not yet declared independence, but the journey had begun. Through closed ports, intolerable truths, long debates, and determined pledges, a people was discovering its voice. It would not be loud at first, but it would grow. And once awakened, it would not be silenced. Chapter 7, The Road to Concord. In the stillness between winter and spring, the American colonies stood like a breath held too long. Something unspoken lingered in the wind. From Massachusetts to Virginia, fields that once echoed only with the hum of plows and the rustle of cornstalks began to hear a different rhythm. Quietly, behind barns and in forests dappled with moonlight, men gathered. They were farmers and cobblers, smiths and millers. But at night they became something else. Muskets were checked and powder horns filled. In small circles lit only by lanterns, the old men spoke softly of ancient rights, and the young listened with fire in their chests. They called themselves Minutemen, pledged to be ready at a moment's call. There were no uniforms, no banners, and no trained officers, just resolve. The kind of resolve that grows from years of indignation, from tea tossed into dark harbors, from laws written far across the ocean and enforced with cold steel. British spies reported whispers, stockpiles hidden in Concord, arms being moved under wagons of hay. General Gage, the British commander in Boston, heard these murmurs and grew uneasy. He did not wish for blood, not yet, but the Crown had issued orders. Seize the weapons, scatter the resistance, and remind the colonists of their place. So quietly, troops began to drill. Redcoats, bright and polished, readied for something no longer political, but inevitable. Meanwhile, in the hearts of the colonists, the line between protest and rebellion had thinned. In taverns, voices grew louder. In church sermons, liberty became more than a word. There was no declaration, not yet, no organized war, but the land itself seemed to brace for what was coming. As if every tree, every stone wall, every blade of April grass had overheard the coming storm. The ride begins. April 18th, 1775. The moon hung high, pale and full, casting silver light upon the winding roads of New England. Boston had already fallen into restless sleep, unaware that its midnight would soon be split by hooves and warnings. In the shadows, Paul Revere mounted his horse. He was not a soldier, nor a man seeking glory, just a silversmith with urgency in his blood. Word had reached him. British troops, regulars, were moving west. Their target, Concord, and perhaps even Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who lay in hiding nearby. Time was no longer a luxury. With urgency more than speed, Revere took to the roads, galloping into history. "The regulars are coming," he warned. Not the British, for all were British in name still. But these were the King's men, and they rode not for peace. Lamps flickered in windows as doors creaked open. Sleepy eyes grew wide. In towns like Medford and Lexington, bells were rung, muskets lifted from mantles, and hearts began to pound. Others joined the call. William Dawes rode a separate path, and later, Dr. Samuel Prescott would carry the alarm even farther. Together, they formed a living thread, weaving through the dark countryside and tying community to community with a single message: rise. The night was no longer quiet. It hummed with hooves and breathless urgency. Dogs barked, children cried, but above all, a message moved through the land like thunder before a storm. It was the sound of a people awakening, not with cheers, but with solemn resolve. Something irreversible had begun. Lexington Green. Dawn broke softly over Lexington on April 19th. The sky was still streaked with gray when Captain John Parker's militia stood upon the town green. Perhaps 38 of them, barely more. Some were old enough to remember Indian wars. Others barely past their teens. They had heard Revere's call. They had kissed their wives and mothers goodbye. And now, with breath fogging in the morning chill, they waited. They did not wait to win. They did not wait to fight. They waited to stand, to be seen. A symbol, silent and human, placed squarely in the path of empire. Then, from the misted road, the sound came, the rhythmic beat of boots on packed earth. The redcoats approached, led by Major Pitcairn, nearly 200 strong, polished and grim. Their orders were simple: disperse the militia, march on to Concord, avoid unnecessary bloodshed. For a moment, time seemed to hesitate. The two sides stood, wind brushing through the trees, flags limp, fingers near triggers. And then it happened. A shot. No one could say who fired first. Not then. Not ever. But it echoed across the green like a match lit in a dry field. The air exploded. Muskets flared. Shouts rang out. Smoke curled like a ghost around the branches above. When it cleared, 8 colonists lay on the ground, lifeless. Several more wounded. The redcoats reformed and marched on, their boots dark with dew, and now blood. Behind them, Lexington's green returned to silence. But it would never be the same. The revolution had not been declared, but it had begun. Not in a hall of parchment and signatures, but here, in grass darkened by the first price of rebellion. The battle for Concord. By the time the British reached Concord, the sun had risen fully, casting golden light over the meadows and narrow bridges. But what waited for them was not just a town, it was a people prepared. The Minutemen had rallied. From Sudbury, Acton, Lincoln they had come. Farmers left plows mid-furrow. Shopkeepers shuttered stores. Sons stood beside fathers, shouldering old flintlocks. The British searched the town but found little. The colonists had moved most of the arms already. Tension hung in the air, brittle as glass. At North Bridge it shattered. A volley rang out once more. This time it was the colonists who held the high ground. Smoke wreathed the trees. Shouts echoed across the river. Several British soldiers fell. The rest began to retreat, at first orderly, then frantically. The road back to Boston, once just dirt and stone, now became a gauntlet. Along every fence line, behind every tree, the countryside had come alive. Muskets cracked from behind stone walls. Smoke rose from hedgerows. Men appeared from brush like spirits and vanished again. The redcoats, trained for open-field battle, were not prepared for this invisible army. It was not a formal war. There were no drums or bugles, no generals giving grand speeches. But it was something older, more personal. The defense of home, of land, of children still asleep in nearby houses. By the time the British reached Boston, they had suffered heavy casualties. Dozens killed, nearly 200 wounded. The colonists had lost men too, but they had found something greater. They had found their voice, not through declarations, but through defiance. The world had changed, not on parchment, but in the soil of Massachusetts. What had begun as a protest, taxes, tea, and talk, was now something more, a revolution. And though no one knew how long or how hard the road ahead would be, one thing was certain. They had taken their first step, not in triumph, but in sorrow, not with cheers, but with sacrifice. Yet in that sacrifice, the world heard something unmistakable, the sound of a people who would no longer be ruled by fear. And so, as the April sun warmed the blood-soaked earth and the smoke drifted slowly into the sky, a nation not yet born took its first breath, quiet, unsteady, but alive. Chapter 8. A Siege and a Congress. The air over Boston trembled with the hush before thunder. Spring had come, but no petals fell. Only ash, only smoke, only the uneasy hum of gunpowder dreams. All around the city, on its hills and through the curves of its countryside, men arrived not in columns but in clusters. Farmers, smiths, scholars, fathers. They came with muskets slung on their shoulders and fear hidden beneath resolve. The city, once the crown's proud jewel in New England, now stood encircled, not by professional soldiers in uniforms, but by its own sons. There was no government to command them, no banner to officially rally under, no promise of pay, but something far deeper. A belief that freedom could be seized if only they stayed, if only they stood firm. The siege of Boston did not begin with drums or declarations, but with silence and the slow drawing of lines in the earth. After Lexington and Concord, colonial militias flooded the countryside, cutting off the British garrison within the city like a fortress slowly choked by vines. From Roxbury to Cambridge, from Dorchester to Charlestown, every farmhouse became a lookout, every barn a storehouse, every family a quiet conspirator in the making of something immense. Inside the city, British General Thomas Gage held his position. Redcoats patrolled the cobbled streets while Loyalists waited with clenched teeth, staring across the harbor at the gathering storm. Ships came and went with supplies, but even the sea felt too narrow now. The city was shrinking, not in size, but in spirit. The British might still hold the center, but the soul of Boston was shifting outward, toward the hills, toward the men who watched from the shadows, waiting for the moment to rise. And rise they did, not with a single voice but with many. It was not an army yet, but a will. The siege was quiet, mostly, punctuated by small skirmishes and distant cannon fire. But the silence held weight. It was the sound of a nation being born, not with speeches, but with presence. Boston, once the cradle of British authority in America, had become the crib of resistance. Surrounded by its own people, it stood as both prisoner and symbol, a warning and a promise of what was to come. The Second Continental Congress. Far to the south, the city of Philadelphia once again gathered the minds and spirits of 13 colonies. In the halls of the Pennsylvania State House, the Second Continental Congress assembled beneath high ceilings and heavy expectation. The scent of wax, parchment, and perspiration filled the room where arguments took the place of arms. For now, they had come from every corner, from Georgia's plantations to New York's harbors, from Virginia's grand estates to the rugged towns of New Hampshire. Some were merchants, some farmers, some lawyers, all reluctant architects of revolution. There was no easy unity. Some sought reconciliation. Others whispered independence. All knew the path ahead was treacherous. The debates were long, the air tense. Should they raise an army? Could they? And if so, under whose hand would they place such a force? There were names. There were doubts. But then, in quiet consensus, they turned toward a man from Virginia, tall and composed, seated with an aura too calm to be mistaken for anything but command. George Washington said little. He did not clamor for the position, but when his name rose through the air, it seemed to settle into place like stone upon foundation. He accepted not with enthusiasm, but with solemnity. He knew what it meant, not just to lead men into battle, but to embody the fragile trust of a people unsure of what they were building. There was no glory here. On June 15, 1775, George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He rose slowly, bowed his head, and spoke with a quiet voice. He would take no salary, he said, beyond what was necessary to cover his expenses. His humility carried more weight than any boast. In that moment, the colonies did not just gain a general. They gained a figurehead, an idea in flesh. And so, as the Congress continued to debate and draft, as it appointed diplomats and printed paper money, it now had something more than ink and rhetoric. It had a man on horseback, soon to ride north, bearing not just a sword, but the first fragile hopes of a republic. A Virginian in command. He rode with a quiet gravity, not flamboyant, not loud, just steady, like a mountain moving. From the streets of Philadelphia to the outskirts of Boston, George Washington traveled not as a conqueror but as a caretaker of dreams too young to walk on their own. His journey north was marked by reverence. People gathered in towns and at crossroads to watch him pass. Some tipped their hats. Others simply stood in silence, as if in the presence of something sacred. When he arrived at Cambridge, the army, if it could be called that, greeted him with a strange mix of awe and disorder. Tents scattered like mismatched stars. Weapons in various states of repair. Men who knew how to hunt but not how to march. There were no uniforms, no formal structure, just clusters of resolve wrapped in homespun cloth. Washington did not shout. He did not scold. Instead, he walked the lines, spoke to the men, and listened. His authority came not from title alone, but from the way he carried it, without ego, with patience. He imposed discipline slowly, not as a tyrant but as a gardener, pruning where needed, letting loyalty take root. He brought order without crushing spirit. He turned the siege from a standoff into a statement. This was no longer a protest, it was war, and it would be fought with dignity. His presence alone began to mold the cause into something tangible. Officers began to dress more formally. Drills were held at dawn. Supplies, though scarce, were better accounted for. Under his hand, the siege lines grew firmer, more defined, not just physically but emotionally. The men who once called themselves militias began to call themselves soldiers. But even Washington knew the danger of illusions. The army was still fragile, still hungry. Many enlistments would soon expire. Powder was low, discipline fragile. Yet, every morning they remained. They dug trenches. They sharpened bayonets. And they waited for the city to break or for the war to begin in full. The first steps of war. Elsewhere, the fire was spreading. Across the colonies, news of the siege, of Washington, of the Congress, stirred the blood of the restless. In upstate New York, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had already struck at Fort Ticonderoga, seizing its cannons and gunpowder, silent, moonlit, quick. The victory was small, but symbolic. A British fort had fallen not to armies, but to willpower and midnight daring. The fall of Ticonderoga was more than strategy, it was a signal. Across the wilderness, towns stirred. Committees of safety began training militias with new seriousness. Couriers rode day and night, spreading news and calls to arms. In the Carolinas, skirmishes erupted. In Virginia, drums beat behind pine and tobacco fields. Even those who still clung to loyalty felt the tremors. Something deeper than disagreement was awakening. A movement once scattered was beginning to breathe with one rhythm. This was not yet a national army. The colonies still acted more like neighbors than siblings. But they were learning. The Continental Congress sent envoys north and south. Supplies moved where they could. A postal system began to carry not just letters but purpose. Slowly, the idea of American was beginning to take form. Still soft, still unspoken, but growing behind every musket raised. Even the British began to feel the shift. Raids grew bolder, attacks more coordinated. What had once seemed a riot now looked more like rebellion. Parliament responded with anger. More troops were sent. More ships arrived. But even their cannons could not silence the whisper that had begun to echo through the trees, across the rivers, beneath the stars. That liberty, once tasted, would not be easily returned. Back at Boston, the siege dragged on. Supplies dwindled, tempers frayed, but the lines held, and in their stillness, something profound stirred. This was not merely a military tactic, it was a quiet, unwavering declaration that the people would not turn away, would not yield. The war had not yet broken open, but it had begun, not with noise, but with endurance. They did not know what would follow. Not the pain, nor the winter, nor the battles that would scar the land. But in these first moments, in this chapter of hushed beginnings, they had done what few believed possible. They had answered power not with plea, but with presence. They had met muskets with pitchforks and orders with will. And perhaps, in some quiet chamber of the future, their footsteps would be remembered not for how loud they marched, but for how firmly they stood, when the world was uncertain, and the road was not yet made, but the dream had already begun to breathe. Chapter 9: The Battle for Bunker Hill. The moon hung low over the harbor, casting a silver hush across the rippling waters between Boston and Charlestown. It was June 16, 1775, and the summer night clung close, thick with the breath of change. Along the narrow neck of land that stretched toward Breed's Hill, colonial men moved in silence, their boots muffled in the dew-covered grass, their shovels glinting like whispering blades. They were farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, citizens called by duty, shaping a hilltop not for crops or commerce, but for defiance. By lantern light they dug. Bent over the earth, they clawed at it with urgency and trembling resolve, erecting earthen redoubts where no such walls had ever been meant to rise. The city of Boston lay just beyond, a flickering mass of candlelit windows and British might. In the soft quiet of night, cannon muzzles glinted like watchful eyes from ships and rooftops. The colonials knew they would be seen with the dawn, but they kept digging. Among them stood Colonel William Prescott, tall and determined, moving among the men with a calm word here, a firm nod there. "Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes," he would later be remembered to have said, though whether the phrase came then or later, none could say for certain. What mattered was the tone. Measured, deliberate, patient. There would be time for thunder. For now, they labored in silence, carving defiance into the soft skin of the hill. As the first hints of daylight brushed the edges of the horizon, the shape of the redoubt took form, an awkward, makeshift fortress of dirt and willpower. Below, in the British camp, officers raised their spyglasses. Confusion gave way to anger. Charlestown had awakened overnight, not to birdsong, but to rebellion. And so the hill waited, dressed in resolve and shadow, daring the empire to come and claim it. Fire and smoke. The midday sun burned down upon Breed's Hill, and with it came the fury of empire. From the harbor, British warships let loose their thunder, their cannons hurling fire into the hills and rooftops. Charlestown's wooden houses caught the flames like dry parchment, and smoke billowed skyward, thick, black, and suffocating. It was no longer a quiet rebellion. It was a storm. From the city below, columns of red emerged. British soldiers, clad in scarlet coats and brass buttons, marched in grim formation across the slope, their bayonets gleaming, their drums like distant thunder. At their head moved General William Howe, confident and composed, leading a force trained for Empire's conquest. But the hill did not tremble. Within the redoubt, the colonials crouched low, hands clenched around muskets, their faces smeared with dirt and fear. They waited behind makeshift barricades of fence posts, stones, and hay bales. Their hearts pounded not only from terror, but from an unbearable anticipation. They had never faced a force like this, orderly, overwhelming, ruthless. The first wave came. Up the slope, the British charged with discipline, confident that these amateur rebels would scatter. But the colonials held. At the last possible moment, when the enemy's faces grew sharp and close, the Americans opened fire. A wall of musket smoke burst from the redoubt, and the British line crumbled. Red coats fell into the grass. The hill erupted with shouts and screams. But still, the colonials held. The second wave followed. Again, Howe's men marched. Again, the colonials fired with terrible accuracy. And again, the British retreated, bloodied, broken, their dead lying thick among the tall grass and smoldering ash. But the third time would be different. With ammunition nearly gone and powder running low, the defenders could no longer deliver volleys. When the final British charge came, bayonets fixed, determination burning through fatigue, the hill could not hold. They breached the redoubt. A fierce, desperate struggle followed, hand to hand, brutal and breathless. The colonials fell back, retreating across the neck of Charlestown as British flags rose over the hill. The ground was taken, but not won. Over 1,000 British dead and wounded lay in the heat and haze. The colonials had lost the hill, but gained something else, something far deeper than dirt. A new respect. As the smoke drifted over the harbor and the fire-scorched roofs of Charlestown smoldered behind them, the survivors limped back to Cambridge, silent, tired, and stained with sweat and soot. Yet among them, a strange current began to rise. Not shame, nor fear, nor defeat, but pride. They had stood. They had resisted. They had made the greatest army in the world bleed. In the heart of London, the news spread slowly at first, carried by dispatches and reports heavy with disbelief. The king's soldiers, professional, battle-hardened, and numerous, had been repelled not once, but twice by what had been considered a ragtag band of colonial dissenters. These were not mobs with pitchforks. These were men who dug, who planned, who waited with discipline. These were soldiers. Within the British command, a quiet shift began. The war ahead, they realized, would not be brief. The colonists would not fold under pressure or flee at the sound of cannon. They would fight and fight fiercely, not only for land or taxes, but for the principle of self-determination. They were untrained, yes, but unafraid. And on the other side, something just as transformative took root. For the colonists, who had once looked with awe at the ordered ranks of the British Army, a revelation had come. Courage could rival training. Grit could match precision. The redcoats bled like any man, stumbled like any man, fell like any man. The myth of British invincibility cracked on the slopes of Breed's Hill. From that day forward, the colonial forces no longer thought of themselves as mere rebels. They were defenders of something fragile but sacred, an idea, a hope, a beginning. In the mud and fire of Bunker Hill, the notion of a future America was baptized, not in ceremony, but in resistance. The blood price, the numbers told a story no trumpet could hide. Over 1,000 British soldiers, killed or wounded, lay accounted for in the grim tallies that followed the smoke. Officers who had once toasted to quick victory now studied casualty lists with pale faces. The cost of claiming a hill, of holding a patch of land no longer strategically vital, was now measured in sons lost, captains buried, and spirits dimmed. Across the Atlantic, Parliament stirred uneasily. What had seemed a colonial disturbance now bore the marks of full-blown war. General Gage, once certain of swift suppression, now requested reinforcements with a tone edged in dread. It became evident. This war would not end with a display of force or a well-worded proclamation. It would not be crushed beneath the heel of tradition. It would take years. It would take lives. And it would take something even more costly, certainty. In the American camps, too, the blood price was deeply felt. Dozens of men who had kissed their children goodbye only weeks before now lay still beneath makeshift crosses. Their names, spoken in sorrow and reverence, became part of a growing litany of sacrifice. And yet, among the grief there was resolve. For each man who fell on Breed's Hill, 100 others would rise, not just to avenge, but to continue. The battle had not been for that hill alone. It had been for the belief that something new might yet be born, something independent, something freer. As the sun dipped beyond the Massachusetts horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and ash, the echoes of musket fire faded. But in hearts across the colonies, a different sound remained, quieter, yet deeper, the sound of awakening, the slow, solemn beginning of a nation not yet formed, but already paid for in blood and fire. And as the stars emerged above the smoky hills, they cast their silent light upon the wounded earth below, upon the redoubt now quiet, the city still smoldering, and the people forever changed. Chapter 10: Voices of Liberty. In the bitter chill of January 1776, with snow blanketing cobblestone streets and chimneys spilling smoke into gray skies, a small pamphlet made its quiet way through taverns, shops, and homes. It was plain in appearance, no gilded binding, no majestic seal, but its words struck like thunder across the colonies. Common Sense by Thomas Paine, a title so modest, yet a message so radical that it shook the very core of the empire. Printed in hurried batches, handed from neighbor to neighbor, and read aloud in gatherings both humble and grand, its message was clear, forceful, and undeniably contagious. Paine spoke not in the lofty prose of aristocrats, but in the tongue of the common man. His pen became a sword. The monarchy, he argued, was unnatural. Hereditary rule was not divine, it was absurd. Why should an island rule a continent? Why should liberty be shackled by tradition oceans away? These were questions many dared not whisper, but Paine thundered them from every page. Each sentence stirred the embers of rebellion that had long smoldered beneath the surface. Colonists who once sought reconciliation began to speak of separation. Independence, once the murmured hope of a few, became a shared heartbeat. The pamphlet sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months, a staggering number for the time. But its true power was not in how many read it, but in how it made people feel. Suddenly, the war was not merely about taxes or tea. It was about destiny, about shedding the weight of kings and stepping, trembling and brave, into the light of self-governance. In every candlelit room where Paine's words were read aloud, something invisible yet powerful awakened. Hope was no longer tentative, it became electric. Jefferson's pen. Far from the din of city crowds, in the soft Virginian summer of 1776, a young man sat at a wooden desk, sunlight pooling on parchment. Thomas Jefferson, tall, composed, and quiet, was just 33. Yet into his hands had fallen the sacred task of shaping a nation's soul into words. The room was still, save for the rustle of paper and the gentle scratching of quill to ink. Jefferson believed in reason, in the harmony of thought and truth. And so he wrote with clarity, with calm intensity. He drew upon ancient philosophy, Enlightenment ideals, and the raw, rising cry of a people aching for freedom. The words came not as commands, but as declarations of rights, self-evident, unalienable. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed not by kings, but by their Creator, with rights no earthly power should dare touch. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 7 words that would echo through time like the toll of a great bell. Behind them stood not just Jefferson, but the shared yearning of countless voices, of farmers and fishermen, of shopkeepers and scholars. As he wrote, others would read and revise. Benjamin Franklin offered wisdom. John Adams lent his fiery conviction. But the melody was Jefferson's, a melody both poetic and piercing, soft and indelible. The Declaration was not only a letter to the king, It was a mirror held to the conscience of a people. When at last the ink dried and the words were set, a quiet breath hung in the air, not from fear, but reverence. What lay on that page was more than prose. It was a promise, a fragile, soaring promise that would soon be tested by war and time. But for that moment, it floated weightless in the summer air. People awakens. Across the 13 colonies, from the rocky coasts of New England to the tobacco fields of the South, the language of liberty began to root itself in the soil. It sprouted in churches where pastors preached of divine justice. It rippled through town meetings, where once muted citizens now stood and spoke with trembling voices. It danced on the lips of children who mimicked the courage of their elders. But awakening was not without unrest. For every cheer that rose at the ringing of freedom's bell, there were whispers of doubt. There were loyalists, neighbors, friends who saw rebellion as madness, who clung to the crown not out of fear, but out of faith. They, too, believed in order, in duty, in what had always been. For them, the break was not liberation but betrayal. Still, the tide surged. Across backwoods and bustling towns, liberty became not just an idea, but a longing. Women stitched flags and tended homes while their sons marched off in ragged lines. Slaves, hearing rumors of emancipation, wondered if this dream included them. Native tribes, caught in the storm's eye, watched the turmoil of settlers who now spoke of rights they had never extended. The movement was imperfect, often blind, yet unstoppable. It was like the breaking of spring, messy, uneven, but sure. And with every passing week, more hearts joined the cause. For some, it was a matter of justice. For others, of faith. But for all, it was a leap into the unknown. A shared decision to dream, even when the path ahead was shadowed. And so the idea of America, still fragile, still forming, began to breathe. Not yet a nation, but no longer a colony. The people were no longer sleeping. They had awakened. The world watches. Across the wide Atlantic, in courts draped in velvet and marble, the tremors were felt. France, still licking its wounds from the 7 Years' War, tilted its ear toward the colonies. Spain watched silently, its ambition stirring. Even the Dutch, far removed, whispered in their merchant halls of what was unfolding in the New World. It was not armies that caused the unease. It was not muskets or militia. It was the spark, small, glowing, relentless, that frightened empires. An idea carried on wind and rumor that people might govern themselves, that the divine right of kings might be a myth, and that liberty might be more contagious than conquest. Diplomats scribbled notes. Spies listened in taverns. Monarchs, seated on ancient thrones, raised eyebrows at reports of declarations and pamphlets. They called it rebellion, but quietly, some wondered, could this succeed? Could peasants and planters truly form a nation? Benjamin Franklin, with his spectacles and sly charm, arrived in Paris not with armies but with words. He spoke of friendship, of shared interests, of common enemies. He courted the French not with threats, but with poetry and wit. Slowly, the court of Louis XVI leaned forward. If the colonies could endure, if they could prove themselves, perhaps France would help. Not for love of liberty, but for rivalry with Britain. Still, in those grand halls, lit by chandeliers and clouded by powdered wigs, something began to stir. The world, once content to dismiss the colonies as restless children, now watched with growing curiosity and unease. For if the British Empire could fracture here, where might it break next? The story of America had become more than its own. It had become a whisper in the ears of kings, a murmur in the streets of Paris, a possibility that frightened and inspired all at once. And so, the revolution marched forward, not only with cannons and courage, but with words. Words that stirred hearts, that crossed oceans, that made the very notion of empire tremble. A war was being waged, yes, but even more powerful than rifles or redcoats was the voice of an idea. Rising, growing, impossible to silence. Liberty, softly spoken, boldly written, fiercely defended. And now, the world was listening. Chapter 11. the Declaration is born. The summer of 1776 lay heavy upon the cobbled streets of Philadelphia. The days grew longer, the sun more unrelenting, as if the skies themselves were watching, waiting, holding their breath. Inside the brick walls of Independence Hall, the air hung not just with humidity, but with the weight of something unspeakably immense. Beneath high ceilings and aging wooden beams, men paced, whispered, argued. Their powdered wigs sat askew with sweat. Their coats, formal and warm, clung uncomfortably to skin that longed for breeze. But no one dared leave. Not yet. They had come from across the 13 colonies, farmers, lawyers, scholars, and merchants, each bearing the burdens of their towns, their kin, and the gnawing hope of a world remade. They sat at long tables covered in green baize, quills in hand, hearts uneasy. The debates were not just about tax or trade, but something deeper, whether they would sever ties with the mightiest empire on earth. Outside, the city lived its ordinary rhythms. Horses clopped past taverns. Children ran through streets, unaware of the solemnity behind the shutters. Bells tolled in nearby churches. But inside the hall, the atmosphere was charged with urgency. The British were marching, ships gathering off the coast. There was no more time for vague protest or half measures. If there was to be a new nation, it needed words. It needed a declaration. The room, though filled with voices, felt strangely quiet, like standing on the edge of a great storm. What had begun as a murmur of rebellion had become a thunderous call. And now, in the unbearable warmth of June, the call demanded form. A committee was chosen. Among them, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a quiet man from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson writes the words. Jefferson was only 33, yet he had the eyes of a man who had read deeply into the soul of human liberty. He did not speak much in Congress, but when he wrote, people listened. His hand was fluent in Latin, Greek, Enlightenment philosophy, and the subtle pulse of poetry. He was chosen to draft the words not because he sought the task, but because the others trusted his pen more than their own voices. He retreated to a modest brick house just blocks from the hall, rented from a bricklayer. There, in a small second-floor room with a view of bustling Market Street, he wrote. He had a plain wooden desk, a few sheets of parchment, a quill, and a steady supply of ink. And as the candlelight flickered late into the night, Jefferson leaned into his task. Not writing for Congress alone, but for history, for posterity, and for a world yet unborn. He drew from Locke and Montesquieu, from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, from Scripture, and from the stirrings of his own heart. He did not write hastily, though he had only days. He weighed each word, measuring its gravity and grace. He wrote of truths that were self-evident, of all men being created equal, of rights endowed by a creator, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then he listed the long train of abuses by a distant king, documenting tyranny with the precision of a scholar and the sorrow of a patriot. The draft was not perfect, and Jefferson knew it. It would be trimmed, shaped, and debated. But the heart of it, the defiant poetry, the moral clarity, it was his, and it pulsed with something that could not be erased. He handed it to Franklin and Adams first. Franklin, older and wiser, offered gentle edits, softening some flourishes. Adams, ever the forceful advocate, read with fierce approval. They took it back to Congress, where it passed through the fire of compromise. Lines were struck, phrases rewritten. Even a passage condemning slavery was removed to hold the fragile unity of the Southern colonies. Jefferson sat quietly, enduring each cut, each revision, each erosion of his perfect ideal. But still, the soul of the document remained. His heartbeat was unchanged, signing with courage. On July 4th, the delegates gathered again in the sweltering room. The final version was read aloud, its words echoing like thunder in a cathedral. Some closed their eyes. Others stared ahead, unmoving. When the reading ended, there was a silence, not from doubt but from awe. They were no longer speaking in protest, they were declaring revolution. A vote was taken. The colonies stood united. Not perfectly, not without tension, but enough. The Declaration was adopted. And then came the moment few would ever forget, the signing. John Hancock, the President of Congress, stood first. He took the quill and signed with a flourish, large and bold. "So His Majesty can read it without his spectacles," he is said to have remarked. It was an act of defiance, but also of deep conviction. He knew what it meant. They all did. Each man who followed signed not as a subject of the crown, but as a rebel, an outlaw in the eyes of the British Empire. Their names, once unknown outside their towns, would now be recorded in London as traitors. If the war was lost, they would not face exile, but the hangman's noose. Still, one by one, they came forward. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Samuel Adams, Benjamin Franklin, each pressed ink into parchment with steady hand, though their hearts surely raced. Franklin, with a wry smile, whispered, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." This was not a signing born of ceremony. It was a binding of souls to a shared fate. They were pledging lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. And they did so not in the glow of triumph, but in the shadow of uncertainty. The world changes. News of the Declaration spread slowly at first, carried by messengers on horseback, read aloud in taverns and churchyards. The words traveled farther than the men who wrote them ever dreamed. Across rivers and valleys, from the lowlands of Carolina to the hills of New Hampshire, farmers paused their plowing, blacksmiths set down their hammers, and mothers held their children a little tighter. The colonies had spoken, not as 13 separate lands, but as one voice. They were no longer colonies. They were the United States of America, a name still trembling in its infancy. The British, hearing of the Declaration, were unmoved. To them, it was an act of foolishness, an illusion of grandeur. But to those in the Continental Army, it was breath, it was a reason to fight, not just to resist, but to build. Washington had it read to his troops. Soldiers, hungry and ragged, cheered with newfound fire. The words lifted them. The Declaration did not end the war. In truth, it deepened it. The British would return stronger, with vengeance. But something irreversible had happened. The world had tilted. The colonies had claimed a new axis, liberty. And though they were outmatched and outnumbered, they had one thing their enemy could never fully grasp: belief. Belief in the dignity of the individual, in the power of words, in the right of a people to shape their own future. And so the war marched on. But now it was not only a fight for land or taxes. It was a struggle for the soul of an idea that would ripple far beyond America's shores. One that would find its way into the hearts of revolutionaries in France, in Haiti, in every corner where people longed to breathe free. In the summer heat of Philadelphia, beneath the creaking rafters of a modest hall, something eternal had been born. Not a government, not yet a nation, but a promise. And promises, once spoken aloud in the presence of hope, have a strange way of echoing forever. The parchment still rests beneath glass now, faded, fragile yet defiant, like the hands that once held it, like the dream it dares to carry. Chapter 12, New York burns and hope retreats. In the breathless summer of 1776, the horizon turned to shadow. Not from clouds, but from sails, hundreds of them, gathering like a storm upon the waters of New York Harbor. From Staten Island to Long Island Sound, the might of the British Empire had returned, larger and louder than before. Ships bristled with cannons. Their hulls creaked with men and muskets. The most powerful navy on earth had come not just to punish rebellion, but to crush it outright. There was no mistaking their purpose. It was said that never before had such a force gathered beneath the Union Jack. General William Howe commanded a fleet of over 400 ships and 32,000 soldiers, professional fighters, loyal Hessian mercenaries, and experienced officers. In the face of such scale, the American position in New York felt almost like a defiant child standing in the shadow of a giant. And yet, Washington waited. He and his young Continental Army, barely 20,000 strong, and many of them still green, held their ground along the city's edges, desperately hoping that perhaps, somehow, courage would count for something more than firepower. The city itself buzzed with fear and anticipation. New Yorkers looked to the harbor and saw their fate arriving slowly, sail by sail. Merchants packed up their goods. Families fled northward. The air thickened with heat, salt, and the scent of coming ruin. The British did not attack immediately. They let their presence speak for them, looming like a nightmare while the patriots beneath their gaze scrambled to prepare. Washington built defenses. Fortifications rose on Brooklyn Heights and across the East River. He wrote letters pleading for more men, more supplies, more time. But time was a luxury the empire would not allow. The invasion began in earnest in late August. British troops landed on Long Island, striking the American defenses from unexpected angles. Washington's lines bent, then broke. Soldiers, many still unused to the chaos of real battle, turned and ran. Muskets jammed in the wet air. Fog rolled across the ground like smoke. Men cried out in confusion, in pain, in retreat. And the thunder of British cannon followed close behind. The fall of Manhattan. Washington had hoped to hold New York. He had hoped that this city, so central, so visible, could become a beacon for the new republic. But hope alone cannot hold ground. After the rout on Long Island, the American position crumbled day by day. British forces outmaneuvered them at every turn, pushing forward with cold precision. Fort Washington, once thought impregnable, fell swiftly after a fierce assault. Nearly 3,000 American troops were taken prisoner. Across the river, Fort Lee soon followed. And with that, the path into New Jersey lay open. As the British advanced, Washington's only choice was to run, to save what remained of his army before it was swallowed whole. But even in retreat, there was no peace. Behind them, New York City burned. On the night of September 21st, fire swept through Manhattan. Flames danced from building to building, devouring shops, churches, and homes. The night sky glowed orange as smoke curled into the stars. No one knew for certain who had set the fire. Some whispered of patriot saboteurs determined to deny the city to the British. Others blamed drunken soldiers or simple chance. But the effect was the same: destruction, total and terrifying. Washington, watching from afar, said little. His men could only stare in silence as the city they had tried to defend collapsed into ashes. By morning, nearly a quarter of Manhattan had been reduced to ruin. The British, now in control, marched through its smoldering streets like victors reclaiming a prize. It was a devastating loss, not just of ground, but of morale. New York was the jewel of the colonies, a city of trade, culture, and dreams. Its fall left the revolution trembling, and with each mile the Americans fled, that trembling deepened into dread. A nation on the run. The retreat through New Jersey was slow, cold, and heartbreaking. Washington's army, once filled with fiery talk of liberty and honor, now moved like shadows through the forests and frozen roads. They marched with torn boots, thin coats, and bellies hollowed by hunger. The wind bit through their ranks like a whip. Some men deserted. Others grew sick and faded away along the path. And all around them, the world seemed to be closing in. British troops pushed relentlessly. The redcoats were never far behind, their banners bright against the gray trees. Town after town fell into their hands. Loyalists emerged from hiding, emboldened by the tide turning back in favor of the crown. And the dream of independence, the spark that had flared so brightly in Philadelphia just months before, began to dim. Across the countryside, many began to wonder if the rebellion had been foolish all along. Farmers refused to feed the army. Local militias dissolved into silence. Newspapers spoke of defeat in hushed tones, trying not to alarm readers already worn thin by war. It was as if the entire cause, the whole fragile hope of a new nation, had climbed too high and now was falling. In December, the retreat reached its lowest point. Washington's army crossed the Delaware River, escaping into Pennsylvania just ahead of the British. There, on the far bank, they made camp. Cold, wet, and exhausted, the soldiers waited in silence. Few fires burned. Few voices spoke. They had lost New York. They had lost New Jersey. And if something did not change soon, They would lose everything. Washington, cloaked in frost and thought, stood among them, not as a general immune to despair, but as a man caught in the same storm. He knew that time was running out. He knew that this winter might be their last. But still he waited. Still he watched the river flow, the crisis of the cause. And then, just when silence seemed eternal, came words. Not from a general's lips or a soldier's heart, but from the pen of a writer, Thomas Paine. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, he wrote. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Paine's pamphlet, titled The American Crisis, appeared like a candle in the dark. Passed from hand to hand, it lit fires in places where embers had nearly gone cold. Read aloud in camps, churches, and taverns, it reminded people why they had dared to rise up in the first place. That freedom was not a gift, but a trial, and only those willing to endure the coldest nights could ever hope to see the dawn. These are the times that try men's souls, Paine had written, and the nation listened. Washington read it to his men on the banks of the Delaware. The words echoed softly through the snow, settling not just in the ears of the weary, but deep in their spirits. Courage, Paine reminded them, was not the absence of fear, but the will to face it. And in those verses, a flicker of purpose returned. Washington, inspired, began to plan. The war was not yet lost. The cause, though wounded, was not yet dead. In the stillness of that December, as the river froze and the winds howled like ghosts, the general began to see a path forward. It would require daring. It would require sacrifice. But it would also remind the world and the empire that America had not yet been broken. The revolution had stumbled. It had wept. It had retreated. But it had not ended. And in that still, icy moment, when New York had burned and hope had fled, something quiet and eternal took root. A whisper, faint as snowfall, that said, "We are still here, and soon the world would remember." Chapter 13, Trenton, Princeton, and the Turning Tide. The wind came first, howling, raw, and endless, threading through the branches of skeletal trees and tugging at the cloaks of men already stiff from frost. Snow followed closely, not in gentle flakes but in sharp sheets of sleet that blurred the world into a swirl of shadows and ice. The Delaware River, swollen and bitter with the weight of winter, lay before them like a challenge whispered by the gods. And yet, on that Christmas night of 1776, as the rest of the world lay still in celebration or slumber, General George Washington stood at the river's edge, not with gifts, but with resolve. The army had known defeat, had tasted it on cold ground and in long retreats, had buried it alongside fallen friends and dwindling hope. But something stirred in Washington that night, something deeper than strategy or necessity. The enemy rested comfortably in Trenton, unaware, perhaps smug. But Washington had come to believe that surprise was the last weapon left to him. If he could wield it just once, clean, sharp, and true, it might slice through the hopelessness and carry the cause forward. Ice cracked beneath boots as the men loaded themselves into flat-bottomed boats. They were fishermen and farmers, not trained mariners, but they pulled at oars with hands numb and soaked. In the darkness, artillery rumbled onto the banks, dragged by hooves and sheer will. The Delaware was no gentle crossing. It roared and churned, laced with ice floes that ground against the boats like slow teeth. But they moved forward, inch by inch, until the far shore finally received them, cloaked in silence and snow. No stars watched them that night. Only clouds and sleet and the breath of something ancient and invisible. It was not just a crossing of water. It was the crossing of fear, the crossing of doubt. And though few would remember the wet clothes or the numb fingers, the echo of that journey would stretch long beyond the banks. Trenton's surprise. Morning came not gently, but suddenly, sharpened by the sound of marching boots and cannon wheels cutting into frozen roads. In Trenton, the Hessians lay deep in slumber, their thoughts far from battle, lulled by the holiday and the bitter belief that no army would stir in such weather. They did not see what came until it was too late. Snow clung to the coats of the Americans as they moved through the streets, silent ghosts with muskets and purpose. Then, in a moment that would change the rhythm of the war, the cannons roared. Iron tore through the morning air, and the sleepy town burst into chaos. The Hessians, caught unprepared, scrambled into streets slick with ice, attempting to form lines and return fire, but confusion reigned. Washington, mounted and calm, directed with clarity, his presence like a lighthouse through the storm. Behind him, the ragged American troops fought not just with weapons, but with something invisible, something burning. For the first time in weeks, they were not running. They were advancing. It was over in under an hour. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured, their pride wrapped in surrender. American losses were minimal, yet the gain was immeasurable. For the soldiers who had crossed that frozen river, the battle was more than a victory, it was a resurrection. The world heard it. The colonies heard it. A scattered people, weary and unsure, now listened to the distant drums of Trenton and felt the tremor in their hearts. The revolution was not dead. It breathed once more, alive in the shouts of victory and the stunned silence of the snow-covered battlefield. Princeton's echo. But Washington was not done. In the days that followed, while the British scrambled to comprehend what had happened at Trenton, he moved again. His army, light on supplies but now lifted by belief, circled south, then west, and prepared to strike at Princeton. The British forces were divided, some moving to retake Trenton, others positioned confidently near Princeton, assuming that the Americans would not dare to attack again so soon. But they had not accounted for the momentum of a reborn spirit. Washington had learned something in the sleet and in the cannon fire, that boldness could be its own kind of armor. On January 3, 1777, the dawn broke once more over a battlefield. This time, at Princeton, the clash came swift and fierce. British regulars fought hard, but Washington rode into the heart of the battle, unshaken. Muskets cracked, hoofs pounded frozen earth, and the thunder of artillery once more echoed across winter fields. At one point, the American line wavered under fire, and it seemed the tide might turn again. But Washington galloped forward, placing himself between his retreating troops and the advancing redcoats. His presence steadied the line like an anchor in a storm. "Hold fast," he called, and they did. The soldiers gathered their strength, leveled their bayonets, and surged forward. The British line broke. Some fled into the woods. Others were taken prisoner. Princeton fell, and with it, another stone crumbled from the British wall of confidence. In London, the news would shake Parliament. In America, it would travel like fire. The myth of British invincibility, carefully maintained, cruelly reinforced, had cracked. Washington had not just won 2 battles. He had redefined the rhythm of the war. It no longer belonged solely to empires and generals. It now pulsed with the beat of something new. Something that moved in camps and cabins, in towns and taverns, in every flickering hope across 13 colonies. Winter's hope. In the weeks that followed, the army did not march to more glory or engage in grand parades. Instead, they found shelter. Cold, makeshift, imperfect shelter, but shelter nonetheless. They rested near Morristown, the wind still bitter but no longer cruel. Here, around fires crackling against frost, the soldiers wrapped themselves not just in blankets, but in belief. The kind that does not rise from victory alone, but from survival. They had crossed rivers that no one believed they would cross. They had walked through storms that no one believed they would endure. They had turned back professional armies with little more than courage and cunning. There was hunger still, cold, disease, and doubt still lingered in the shadows of every tent. But something else moved there too, possibility. Letters were written by candlelight, not of despair, but of wonder, of how they had done what seemed impossible, of how perhaps, just perhaps, this fight was not destined for ruin. Washington walked quietly among his men, his boots crunching the snow, his eyes reflecting firelight and fatigue. He said little, but his silence carried more than speeches. It carried the burden and the beauty of a cause that now felt not only real, but reachable. In homes across the colonies, the stories spread. Stories of a river crossed in darkness, of surprise at Trenton, of defiance at Princeton. Mothers whispered it to children. Elders spoke of it around winter hearths. For the first time, the revolution did not feel like a dream slipping away. It felt like a dream stepping forward. It was still fragile, still fraught with risk and pain, but it was alive. And in the stillness of that winter, in the hush of snow-covered hills and the quiet pulse of fire-warmed hands, a nation began to believe, not in luck, not in miracles, but in its own strength. The tide had not fully turned, but the water had stirred, and somewhere in the hush of frost and fire, in the breath of men who had crossed the river of ice, the future began to whisper, softly but surely, that it could belong to them. Chapter 14: Saratoga and the French Decision. Autumn crept across the wilderness of upstate New York with a kind of quiet patience, dressing the forests in deep amber and crimson. The wind moved like an omen through the trees, low, persistent, carrying with it the distant sound of drums, the crack of musket fire, and the thud of boots against mud-soaked trails. Into this painted silence marched a British army, clothed in red and burdened by confidence. General John Burgoyne, a man of elegance and theater, led his forces southward from Canada, believing that a single bold stroke could cut the American colonies in two. He moved with the weight of a grand design. From the north, he would descend like a blade, slicing through the wild country between Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. General Howe, so it was assumed, would come north from New York City. And in the middle, near Albany, the jaws would close. The rebellion, fragmented and broken, would breathe its last in the wilderness. But the land was not a silent spectator. It was dense, tangled, unforgiving. Trees rose like walls, and rivers cut through valleys with swollen force. Burgoyne's men dragged cannon through bogs, built bridges over impossible creeks, and suffered through heat, hunger, and ambush. The long march devoured their strength, and still the reinforcements never came. No loyalist uprising greeted them. No Southern army answered their call. Instead, resistance bloomed like thorns. The Americans, loosely knit but fiercely determined, harassed the flanks, felled trees to block roads, and vanished like smoke after every strike. The battle was not yet one of grand fields and cannon fire. It was a slow bleeding through forest shadows, an attrition of hope and supply. And as Burgoyne pressed forward, the noose tightened. The trap at Saratoga. By the time Burgoyne reached the rolling fields near Saratoga, the wilderness had already taken its toll. His men were weary, stretched thin, their uniforms tattered by brambles and rain. His supply lines, long and exposed, had been cut. The countryside around him, once expected to be fertile ground for loyalist allies, now swelled with enemy soldiers, men who had risen from farms, from towns, and from silence, to form the northern wing of the Continental Army. Facing him were American forces led by General Horatio Gates, a man of calm and command, and by Benedict Arnold, whose energy and fury burned hotter than the muskets he charged beside. Though tension seethed between the two officers, on the field their armies moved with unity. They had dug in on high ground, fortified with logs and defiance, forming a crescent that wrapped tighter with each passing day. The battles of Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights were fought in bursts of smoke and blood. The thunder of artillery cracked through the trees, and musket fire rose like lightning against the dusky sky. Arnold, though officially removed from command, could not be restrained. He stormed the field on horseback, wild with courage, rallying troops where lines broke, leading charges that splintered British defenses and sent redcoats reeling into the woods. By mid-October, it was clear. The British army was trapped. No reinforcements came from the south. No escape beckoned from the north. Surrounded, outnumbered, and starving, Burgoyne was forced to surrender. On October 17, 1777, beneath the falling leaves, the redcoats laid down their arms. Nearly 6,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war. And as the cannon fell silent, a new sound filled the air, one not of gunpowder or cries, but of history changing course. Saratoga was not just a victory, it was a signal, a message carried on wind and parchment, destined to cross oceans. The world takes notice. The Atlantic stretched wide and endless, a sea of distance and diplomacy. But when news of Saratoga reached Europe, it shattered the stillness like a stone cast into deep water. In France, where salons hummed with talk of revolution and kings eyed the rebellion with cautious interest, the surrender of Burgoyne did not pass quietly. It was the turning point they had waited for, the proof that the Americans could win. In Parisian corridors lit by candlelight and shadowed by ambition, ministers leaned over maps, and diplomats whispered in smoky voices. For years, France had watched the war unfold like a gambler eyeing a rival's hand. They had provided quiet support, arms, ammunition, supplies sent through false merchants and secret channels. But now, the question was no longer if the Americans could endure. It was whether France should commit everything. King Louis XVI, a monarch whose court sparkled with silks and suspicion, faced a delicate balance. War with Britain would risk French ships, French blood, and French coin. But it also offered a chance at vengeance, for the humiliation of the 7 Years' War, for the loss of Canada, for the echoing defeat that had lingered in French pride. And now, with the British Army captured in a North American field, with the rebellion proving its resolve, the decision drew closer. In London, the surrender at Saratoga rang like an alarm. British politicians grew anxious. The war, once expected to end in quick dominion, now dragged on with uncertainty. The world had taken notice, and the war, once a colonial dispute whispered through wooded valleys, now echoed across empires. Alliance in the shadows. Even before the ink dried on surrender documents in Saratoga, shadows were moving in Paris. In discreet drawing rooms and private estates, American envoys met with French ministers. Among them was Benjamin Franklin, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, a man who wore simplicity as armor and charm as a blade. He moved through the French court with deliberate grace, sipping wine, offering wit, and pressing the case for revolution. Alongside Franklin stood Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, diplomats of resolve, if not always unity. Together, they negotiated in silence and candlelight, their every word a gamble. The French, cautious but intrigued, offered promises cloaked in secrecy. Letters were drafted, treaties hinted at, but still the crown hesitated. A single misstep could bring ruin. Then came Saratoga, a victory so undeniable, so dramatic, that hesitation gave way to decision. On February 6, 1778, in a quiet room behind closed doors, France and the American colonies signed 2 treaties. The first was a treaty of amity and commerce, open, official, a recognition of American sovereignty. But the second, deeper, more fateful, was a treaty of alliance. It was a promise that France would go to war with Britain if Britain refused to recognize American independence. A signal to the world that this rebellion was no longer just a colonial quarrel, but a global upheaval. France prepared its fleets, gathered its armies, and entered the storm. Spain would follow soon. And far from the forests of New York, new battle lines were drawn across seas and continents. In taverns across New England, in huts among the soldiers at Valley Forge, the news arrived like a rising sun. The French were coming not just in hope, but in war. And with them came ships, arms, men, and belief. The American Revolution had begun as an ember in the wilderness. Now, with Saratoga as spark and France as wind, it roared into something greater, a fire that would light the path toward independence. And as the war widened, the hearts of a fledgling nation beat louder. In the silence after the battle, in the echoes of cannon and paper, a truth began to form, that the world was watching, that even in the darkest forest, history could turn on the footsteps of the brave, and that sometimes the winds of freedom begin with a single surrender. Chapter 15, Valley Forge and the Will to Endure. The snow fell like silence over Valley Forge. A cold, steady hush blanketed the ragged tents that lined the frozen hills, as if the land itself were holding its breath. It was December of 1777, and the American Revolution had reached its cruelest pause, a winter not marked by the roar of cannons, but by the aching stillness of suffering. The Continental Army, weary and worn, had marched into the stretch of Pennsylvania woods not with celebration, but with resignation. Over 12,000 men came to Valley Forge, and in time, nearly a quarter of them would never leave. There were no battles here, not in the way the history books often imagine. The enemy was not a British redcoat. It was hunger, exposure, disease, despair. The men built crude huts from damp logs, their roofs patched with straw, bark, whatever scraps could be scrounged. Inside, they slept in shifts to share warmth. Blankets were few, shoes even fewer. Some walked barefoot in snow, their feet wrapped in rags or tied with strips of old shirts. Blood stained the white earth as frostbitten toes blackened and died. Each sunrise was a test of endurance, each sunset a whisper of mercy. They boiled leather to eat. They ground flour from scorched wheat, mixed with water and ash. Dysentery crept through the camp like a shadow. Pneumonia stole voices in the night. The cries of the suffering did not echo. There was no strength left to cry loud, just a murmur of coughing, shivering, praying. And yet, through this frost-bitten valley, something quiet and powerful stirred. Not the fire of rage, but the ember of resolve. The men had not come for glory, but because they believed in something invisible, something worth suffering for. Valley Forge was not just a location. It became a crucible. In this place of ice and pain, the American spirit was tested. Not on the battlefield, but in silence, hunger, and cold. And somehow it did not break. Washington's quiet strength. He did not shout commands or ride with a sword drawn. He walked. Day after day, General George Washington stepped through the snow-packed paths of the encampment, wrapped in his heavy blue cloak, his breath steaming in the winter air. He walked not above his men, but among them, moving slowly from one hovel to the next, stopping to speak softly, to nod, to listen. There was something in the way he stood, tall and still, that steadied those who looked upon him. He carried the weight of a crumbling army on his shoulders, and yet he did not show it. In the privacy of his tent, he wept in prayer, he wrestled with fear. Supplies were running out. Congress sent few answers, fewer provisions. Officers resigned, morale frayed, enlistments expired. Yet Washington remained, anchoring the army with the calm certainty of someone who refused to surrender to hopelessness. When food wagons arrived, weeks late, half empty, it was he who directed the portions. When tents collapsed beneath ice and rot, it was he who insisted on rebuilding. When mutterings of desertion crept through the ranks, it was his presence, silent, noble, persistent, that held the line. He needed no speeches, no theatrics. His faith in the cause, and in the men who followed him, was quiet but unshakable. And that quiet faith passed like a torch through the darkness. At Valley Forge, Washington was not just a general. He was the center of gravity around which a fragile dream hovered. Where others might have fled or faltered, he endured. Where despair might have bloomed, his stillness planted hope. In silence, in suffering, in snow, he held them together. Von Steuben's discipline. Then came the stranger from across the sea, from a past of European military grandeur, with a name that would echo through American memory like steel against stone. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived in February, just as the winter's grip seemed most cruel. He spoke little English, wore a splendid uniform, and carried a fierce expression, half nobleman, half soldier. At first, the soldiers didn't know what to make of him, but soon, the snow-covered fields of Valley Forge began to tremble beneath a new rhythm. Von Steuben began with a handful of volunteers. He drilled them in formations, step by step, movement by movement. Shoulders back, muskets lifted, bayonets fixed. Again and again. He cursed in French, muttered in German, and eventually taught in broken English, repeating commands until muscle and instinct became one. He made soldiers out of farmers, discipline out of chaos. Every morning, men lined up on the frozen parade ground, boots scraping frost, rifles in hand. They learned to march, to reload faster, to fight as one body. It was not just technique, it was transformation. With every hour spent in the bitter wind, they became something more. Not a scattered collection of rebels, but an army, organized, trained, unified. Von Steuben rewrote the army's manual by hand. He restructured their camps for cleanliness, for health, for order. Disease slowed, morale lifted, laughter returned, sometimes even if briefly. The men began to look not just to survive the winter, but to be ready for what came after it. And when new recruits arrived, they no longer found a band of starving souls. They found something closer to a nation in arms. In the deep chill of Valley Forge, von Steuben was the hammer and Washington the anvil. Between them, the raw iron of American will was forged into something sharper, something stronger, the forge of resolve. And then, at last, the ice began to melt. In April, the snow turned to mud. The trees awakened, thin buds reaching for sunlight. The fires burned longer now, not only for warmth but for bread. The streams flowed with spring runoff, and the air, though still cold, no longer cut like glass. Out of the huts and tents they came, leaner but standing straighter. Their uniforms were patched, but their eyes held purpose. There was pride now in the way they marched, the way they stood at attention. Valley Forge had not defeated them. It had refined them. Letters home spoke of survival, not surrender, of learning, not loss. And when they finally broke camp that June, the soldiers did not slink away. They marched. File by file, musket by musket. They moved with a cohesion born not of ease, but of shared pain. Behind them lay the valley that had tried to bury them. Ahead, the war still raged, but something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer just patriots. They were professionals. They had bled together, starved together, endured together, and now they would fight together, not only for independence, but for each other, for a vision of freedom they had tasted in the cold and carried in their hearts. Valley Forge, in the end, was not a symbol of defeat. It was the birthplace of resolve. Here, in the heart of winter, the American Revolution was not won, but it was saved. It was not a place of glory, but of grit, and it whispered a truth that would echo through all the battles yet to come. Freedom is not always born in victory. Sometimes, it is shaped in the silence, in the snow, in the slow breath of men who refuse to give up. And so they left that valley not as they came, but as something new, forged not in fire alone, but in frost, not in triumph, but in endurance. Valley Forge did not break them. It built them, and history would remember not just what they fought for, but how they endured to keep that dream alive. Chapter 16, Treason, Sea Battles, and the Southern Flame. Once, he had been hailed as a hero. His name had ridden the wind of victory through the smoke of Saratoga, whispered in reverence among men who risked their lives for the dream of liberty. Benedict Arnold, bold, relentless, scarred in body and pride, had given his blood for the revolution. But glory is a fragile crown, and beneath its shimmer, shadows gathered. In the quiet corridors of power, Arnold found himself passed over, reprimanded, questioned. The very Congress that had once praised him now criticized him. Wounds unhealed, not only of flesh, but of honor. He watched others ascend while his sacrifices were forgotten, buried beneath suspicion and political maneuvering. The bitterness grew. The gratitude he had once received felt as distant as the thunder of cannons on distant hills. And so, in the twilight between loyalty and betrayal, he made a choice. Arnold reached across the line. To the British, he offered not only secrets, but a prize, the key to the Hudson, West Point. A fortress, a gate, a lifeline. In exchange, he asked for gold, a rank, a new allegiance. But fate interrupted the treason. The courier, Major John Andre, was captured, and the plot unraveled like a frayed flag in the wind. Arnold fled to British lines, leaving behind the cause and comrades he had once sworn to protect. The name that once evoked valor now became a hiss, synonymous with betrayal, echoing like a curse across generations. Washington, silent in his sorrow, looked upon the place Arnold had tried to surrender and said nothing. For what could be said when a brother in arms turned against the very soul of the cause? Treason, when it comes from within, does not strike like a soldier. It seeps like a wound, quiet, poisonous, and slow to heal. John Paul Jones strikes. While betrayal struck on land, out upon the restless sea, courage had not fled. The revolution had no grand navy, no towering fleet like Britain's. but it had men, men of iron will and salt-weathered skin. Among them stood John Paul Jones, a name destined to be carried on the ocean winds like a legend. Jones did not command grand ships of war, but what he lacked in size, he matched with unshakable resolve. He understood the language of the sea, the roll of the waves, the creak of the mast, the heart of a storm, and in that knowledge he found a kind of power. It was aboard the Bonhomme Richard, a worn but defiant vessel, that Jones would stake his place in history. In 1779, off the coast of Flamborough Head, Jones confronted the British ship Serapis, far superior in might. The night was black, lit only by the flicker of cannon bursts. Timber groaned, men shouted, powder smoke turned the air into choking mist. At the height of the battle, with his ship burning and shattered, Jones was called to surrender. He did not. His answer, like fire through the storm, would become immortal. "I have not yet begun to fight." And fight he did, with shattered hull and bleeding hands. He lashed the Bonhomme Richard to the Serapis, refusing to let either ship flee. The two became one, locked in a death embrace. And by morning, when the smoke drifted into the sea, it was Jones who remained. He sailed not for conquest, but for defiance. His battle was not only against British might, but against the belief that the revolution could not endure. Out there on the dark waters, amidst the crash of waves and war, he proved that even the weakest vessel, if guided by an unbreakable soul, could shake an empire. The war moved south. The revolution, once centered in the north, began to drift with the seasons. The British, frustrated by the resistance in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, turned their gaze southward, to Georgia and the Carolinas, where loyalist sentiment simmered and warm ports promised advantage. Savannah fell with barely a cry. Georgia, the youngest of the colonies, became the first reclaimed by the crown. Charleston, the jewel of the South, would be next. The city, surrounded by rivers and marsh, fought bravely, but in May of 1780, it surrendered, the largest American capitulation of the war. Over 5,000 soldiers laid down their arms. The British campaign in the South was brutal. They believed the region would rise in loyalty, but found instead a land weary of war and divided in soul. Battles no longer followed gentlemen's rules. The countryside became a chessboard of violence, with each hill, forest, and crossroad carrying its own echo of bloodshed. At Camden, the Americans faltered. General Gates, once a celebrated figure after Saratoga, suffered a humiliating defeat. Militia scattered, and for a time, the Southern cause looked as if it might collapse entirely. But even in the deepest shade of despair, the embers of resistance glowed. The South, scarred and trampled, would not be conquered so easily. There was something in the soil, something wild, defiant, and unbreakable. It stirred beneath the moss-draped oaks and among the broken fences of farmsteads. It whispered in swamps and thundered in hills. The revolution had moved south, but so too had its fire. Guerrillas in the swamp, in the Carolina lowlands, where the air hung heavy with moisture and the ground swallowed footsteps, war transformed. It no longer marched in columns or stood in polished rows. Crept, vanished. It struck from the shadows and disappeared before the echo faded. This was the realm of men like Francis Marion, the swamp fox. Marion did not wear the war like a uniform. He wore it like a second skin. With a handful of devoted men, he mastered the art of disappearing. One moment they were farmers, fishermen, and millers. The next they were ghosts with muskets rising from the fog. They burned bridges, ambushed patrols, freed prisoners, and when the British struck back, they found only marsh and silence. Marion's forces never held ground. They held purpose. In every strike, they reminded the enemy, the land would not yield. His men had no tents, few supplies, and little food. They marched barefoot, slept beneath the stars, and lived on what the woods could offer. Yet their spirit outpaced their suffering. For they were not fighting for territory alone. They were fighting for memory, for the right to shape their own story. Across the southern countryside, other leaders rose with similar fury. Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens, backwoodsmen and partisans who knew the forests like kin and struck with the unpredictability of lightning. This was no longer the war that had begun at Lexington and Concord. It had shed its code of rules. It had become something primal, and the British, for all their might, could not understand it. Their formations crumbled before invisible foes. Their supply lines were cut by men who had no flags but fought with hearts full of thunder. The South burned, yes, but it burned with the fire of resistance. In the quiet stillness of the swamp, where moonlight turned the water silver and frogs sang through the night, the revolution found a new face. One that wore no medals and claimed no cities. But it endured. It endured because, in that murky wilderness, liberty did not march. It ran. It struck. It vanished. And it returned again and again until even the empire began to tremble. And so, as the war raged in shadow and storm, the people of the South, battered, cornered, and desperate, lit a flame that would not die. A flame passed from hand to hand, through blood and sorrow, until one day it would ignite the final blow. As twilight settled over this chapter of the Revolution, the names were many: Arnold's betrayal, Jones's defiance, Charleston's fall, and Marion's ghostly march. But beneath them all lay one truth: the spirit of the Revolution could not be chained. Even in its darkest hours, it flickered, whispered, and roared. And that flame, wild and wandering, would find its way toward the dawn. Chapter 17: Yorktown and the Last Cannon. The heat of early autumn clung to the coats of soldiers as they marched southward, their boots pressed deep into the soil of a war-weary land. Washington led the column not with triumphant fanfare, but with a grave and focused silence. This was no ordinary movement of troops. This was a final stroke, painted carefully over years of struggle, hunger, heartbreak, and hope. Beside him, the young Marquis de Lafayette rode with quiet intensity, his heart tied not just to France but to the dream that had kept the Revolution alive. Ahead, beyond Virginia's woods and fields, lay the last real hope of British power on the American mainland, General Cornwallis and his fortified encampment at Yorktown. The American army was not alone. Draped in powdered wigs and bright uniforms, French infantrymen marched with them, their songs and language strange to the ears of local farmers watching from porches and fence lines. But their purpose was one and the same. Together, they moved like a tide pulled by something greater than any single man. What Cornwallis did not yet know was that the walls closing in on him were being built not just by the army advancing from the north, but by sails gathering to the south, moving across waters he could not yet see. At Yorktown, Cornwallis believed himself safe. He had fortified the peninsula, placing his troops near the water, expecting support to come by sea. But the chessboard of war had been rearranged while he wasn't looking. The pieces were moving with quiet precision. Washington's plan, forged in secrecy, was already unfolding. Cornwallis had walked into a snare he could not feel until it was far too late. The trap was set, not by brute force, but by timing, patience, and the shared breath of two continents united by a cause. The roads behind were no longer open. The ships ahead would not arrive. And all around him, the earth would soon tremble. French fire from the sea. Far from the dust of marching boots, another story was being written on the waves. Off the coast of Virginia, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse had arrived, and with it came the final seal of fate. With sails taut and cannons primed, the French Navy cut through the sea like blades of wind. Their mission was clear: prevent British reinforcements from reaching Cornwallis. Hold the bay. Seal the mouth of the beast. On September 5, 1781, the waters of the Chesapeake echoed with cannon fire as French and British ships collided in thunder and flame. The Battle of the Capes was not the grandest naval engagement in history, but in this moment, it was everything. De Grasse's ships, confident and skillful, pushed the British fleet back, denying them entry and forcing their withdrawal. In doing so, they slammed shut the last gate Cornwallis might have used to escape. There would be no retreat, no reinforcement, no rescue. For the first time in the war, the British were surrounded not just by land, but by sea. The Atlantic, once a bridge to empire, had become a wall. With the French fleet guarding the coast, and Washington's army pressing in from the land, the stage at Yorktown was no longer a battlefield. It was a prison. Cornwallis could not know that the sky above Yorktown would soon be filled with smoke and fire, that the wind he once trusted would carry the enemy's banners, that the walls he believed could hold would shake beneath the weight of Allied firepower. The sea, once his salvation, now whispered defeat in the rhythm of its waves. The trap had not only closed, it had been locked, and the key cast into the ocean. The night of bombardment. The sun dipped low on October 9th, and silence gave way to a sound the world would not forget. A sudden, rolling thunder that shook the sky and cracked the ground. American and French cannons roared to life in unison. Their shells streaking through the night like falling stars turned to flame. Yorktown trembled, earth shattered, and within the British trenches, men huddled in fear as death rained down in unbroken waves. The bombardment continued day and night, each hour a drumbeat of resolve. The Americans had built siege lines under cover of darkness, inching ever closer, digging trenches, hauling artillery, laying the bones of war into the soil. Washington himself fired the first shot, a symbolic act that echoed through every cannon thereafter. Each explosion tore deeper into British defenses. Homes splintered, fortifications crumbled. Tents were ripped apart by invisible fists of fire and steel. The French, trained in the precision of European siege warfare, moved with disciplined fury. Redoubts, those small but stubborn defensive bulwarks, stood in their path. On October 14th, 2 of them were taken in dramatic assaults. American troops stormed Redoubt 10 with bayonets fixed, their battle cries swallowed by cannon fire. Alexander Hamilton, the young officer long aching to prove himself in combat, led the charge through smoke and musketry. At Redoubt 9, French soldiers surged with equal resolve, their flags rising beneath volleys of musket fire. The British, trapped and cornered, fought bravely. But the sky would not clear, the air would not still, and with each passing hour, the horizon drew closer. Not the horizon of escape, but of surrender. In the distance, women and children watched from cellars and hollowed homes, praying that the stone and fire above would somehow spare them. Soldiers slept only in fits and fragments. Horses screamed, trees caught flame, the earth groaned beneath the thunder of war, and still, the cannons sang. This was not just battle. This was the crescendo of a long, painful symphony. The final night of bombardment echoed with all the fury, grief, and longing of a revolution near its end. The white flag rises, and then a silence. On the morning of October 17th, a white flag rose above the British encampment. It fluttered in the weak wind like a ghost in the aftermath of a storm. The guns fell silent, the smoke cleared, and from the broken heart of Yorktown, an aide emerged under truce, carrying a message from Cornwallis. Negotiations had begun. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, the surrender was made formal. American and French forces lined the road with solemn pride. The British, in full uniform, marched out to the rhythm of a drumbeat that marked the closing of an era. Cornwallis himself, shamed and ill, did not attend the ceremony. His second-in-command, General O'Hara, offered the sword of surrender instead. It was first extended to the French, but Rochambeau deferred. The honor would belong to Washington, but Washington, too, turned away, symbolically passing the act of surrender to his own second-in-command. A silent gesture that echoed with dignity and grace. There would be no humiliation, only history. The war would not officially end until 2 years later with the Treaty of Paris. But in spirit, in truth, in the hearts of all who had fought and wept and waited, the fight had already ended. The last cannon had roared. The last wall had fallen. And across the world, monarchs and ministers now knew. The American experiment had not only survived, it had won. Children would grow up in the shadow of that white flag, learning not just the story of victory, but the story of endurance, of unity born from difference, of hope carved from despair. In the years to come, Yorktown would become more than a place. It would become a memory etched into the soil of a new nation, not just where the war ended, but where a new beginning quietly took its breath. And so, as dusk settled over the fields once torn by cannon and fire, the land exhaled. The soldiers laid down their arms, and the night at last was still. Chapter 18: The Peace and the Birth of a Nation. In the still halls of Paris, where chandeliers hung over silent negotiations and the windows opened to a city untouched by war, history was quietly being written. It was September of 1783. Far from the forests of New York and the scorched docks of Charleston, far from the cannon smoke of Yorktown or the frozen banks of the Delaware, three American men sat across from the emissaries of a once indomitable empire. The ink in their pens held more weight than armies. For 8 long years, the colonies had struggled, suffered, and resisted. Now, in this quiet room with parchment stretched before them, they would be called something new: the United States of America. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay signed with tired hands and steady hearts. They knew the price already paid: blood in Saratoga, tears in Valley Forge, silence in homes now empty of sons. Britain's signature came reluctantly, yet it came. The Treaty of Paris acknowledged what battles had already proven. The colonies were free. The war was over. But peace does not arrive like a storm breaking. It comes gently, almost invisibly, in the space between signatures and ship departures. The treaty recognized borders and named rivers, yet it could not erase scars. Still, it was a promise, fragile but real. The Atlantic no longer separated a colony from its ruler. It now divided 2 sovereign nations. In cities like Philadelphia and Boston, church bells rang softly. In taverns and town squares, people read the printed words with wide eyes. "We are free," they whispered, some aloud, some only in their hearts. And in fields where crops bent under early autumn wind, farmers stood straighter beneath a flag that was no longer rebellion, but recognition. In Paris, Franklin folded his copy and held it to his chest. For a moment, he closed his eyes, not as a diplomat, not even as a father of revolution, but as an old man remembering every cost and every flame that hadn't gone out. A general resigns. Back in America, a different silence was unfolding. It was not the stillness of diplomacy, but of honor. In Annapolis, Maryland, the Continental Congress waited in the modest State House, where pinewood walls held the scent of ink and sweat. It was December now. Winter's edge nipped at windows. A man entered, not as a king, not even as a president, but as a soldier. George Washington stood before the assembled Congress with quiet dignity. He did not wear the robes of victory. His uniform was simple. His face bore the wear of years at war, lines drawn by frostbite and grief, not pride. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sword, the one he had worn from Cambridge to Yorktown. Without flourish, he placed it on the table. "I resign," he said. "I return to private life." No one spoke for a long moment. This had never been done before. In a world where generals often crowned themselves kings, Washington chose humility. In the act of surrendering power, he became greater than those who clung to it. He had led men through darkness, and now he stepped into the shadows so that the nation could step into the light. From the gallery, onlookers wept. Some bowed their heads. For many, it was the truest moment of revolution. Not the storming of redoubts or the declarations from pulpits, but this quiet yielding, this return to home. Washington would ride back to Mount Vernon, his estate on the Potomac. He longed for the soil, for the comfort of walking among his orchards, for the scent of wood smoke rising from hearths that asked nothing of him. Yet history would remember him not for retreating, but for teaching a new nation that power must be borrowed, not possessed. In Annapolis that day, liberty gained something more enduring than victory. It gained an example. 13 become 1. The war had ended. The army had disbanded. But the greater challenge remained: how to bind 13 separate states, 13 stubborn identities, into a single nation. In candlelit chambers, delegates argued, scribbled drafts, and debated the shape of governance. What emerged in 1781, even before the treaty was signed, was the Articles of Confederation, a document delicate as a paper boat on stormy seas. The Articles were not perfect. They granted little power to a central government. There was no president, no judiciary strong enough to steady disagreements, no means to raise taxes. But for the moment, it was enough. It was a beginning. It was unity, however brittle. Each state had its own character. Massachusetts burned with idealism. Virginia bore pride like a crown. Georgia looked southward, while New York looked outward. Yet they all carried something shared, memories of snow-laden camps, of taxes uninvited, of voices long silenced and now free to speak. The flame of shared struggle still glowed, and so they leaned toward one another, imperfectly but earnestly. The new Congress met in fits and starts like a fledgling learning to fly. It governed over land disputes, negotiated debts, and tried to find a language that all states could speak. Slowly, the idea of America began to form, not just as a name, but as a nation. No longer just Virginians or Pennsylvanians. People began to whisper something new. We the people. On maps, the name United States appeared in clean ink. On ships, the flag with 13 stars waved gently over quiet waves. And in hearts, there was a cautious hope, a fragile belief that the war had birthed not chaos, but covenant. A quiet dream begins. The revolution did not end in a blaze. It faded like twilight, softly, gradually, into something uncertain but peaceful. Soldiers returned to farms, to workshops, to streets that now bore names of victory. Children who once watched battles from hillsides now played beneath flags stitched by their mothers. Freedom did not roar, it settled like snowfall. In New Jersey, a blacksmith built a new forge, heating iron not for muskets but for plows. In South Carolina, a widow reopened her bakery. Her son's gone, but her oven's lit once more. In Connecticut, a schoolteacher began a new lesson, this time not on British kings, but on American liberty. The stars on the flag were still 13, but they shimmered with dreams far beyond their number. Every home that once trembled at the sound of marching feet now dared to imagine peace as normal, not rare. The fields that had seen blood now bore wheat. The rivers, once clogged with warships, now welcomed trade. There was no royal ceremony, no grand fireworks. But in small towns and wide valleys, a quiet miracle unfolded. The transformation of rebellion into republic. The people were learning how to govern themselves, not with perfection, but with effort. And in that effort was the soul of the revolution, more enduring than muskets or drums. At night, fathers lit candles and read aloud from newspapers that no longer feared censorship. Mothers stitched not just clothes, but stories. Tales of courage and loss, of crossings and campfires. And children listened, their eyes wide, their dreams reaching beyond the fence lines of their farms. In that stillness, a new kind of dawn began. The war was over. The struggle had changed. But beneath the stars of their new sky, the people of the United States began to live not in resistance, but in promise. And thus, the revolution ended not with a bang, but with breath. Not with conquest, but with care. Not with kings, but with hope. Softly, like the tide receding from bloodied shores, a new world stepped forward. And in that hush, America was born.